All right, ready? Ready? Good morning, everyone. Committee will come to order, and at the conclusion of the opening statements yesterday, the chair called up H.R. 1582, and the bill was open for amendments at any point. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Seeing none, we'll go to other amendments. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Texas. For what purpose?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to the committee print of H.R. 1582 offered by Mr. Barton of Texas.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The text of the amendment will be given to the members, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
I thank, excuse me, I thank the chairman. At the markup at subcommittee, we had a very lengthy and spirited discussion with Ranking Member Rush of the subcommittee and Ranking Member Waxman of the full committee about an amendment that Mr. Rush had put into play that went into some detail on estimating the benefits of specific rules and also the cost. There was some discussion about accepting the Rush amendment as is. There was some discussion about withdrawing it, but at the end of the markup, it was a decision to continue to work with Mr. Rush with no guarantees either way that the minority would accept a compromise, nor was there a guarantee that the majority would accept it. But in any event, a good faith effort was made to find a middle ground between the minority and the majority, and my staff indicates to me that those discussions were serious and that they were heartfelt, but that no compromise could be agreed upon. Consequently, this amendment is my attempt to, in the spirit of what we agreed to do at the subcommittee markup, to incorporate as much of the Rush amendment as we could and to the Barton amendment, and then move forward. So this amendment would try to delineate the relationship between the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency, and also give some additional definition to exactly how you define benefits and cost and how you calculate them. I will say, Mr. Chairman, while this was not a part of the discussion, my staff has given me information about the so-called social cost of carbon that the EPA has begun to use when trying to estimate both the benefits of some of their rules and the cost if you were not to implement these new rules. I have spent some time trying to understand the social cost of carbon, and as far as I can determine, it's an elegant way to basically, when you propose a rule, you can plug in certain numbers and you can get any benefit that you want from it using various discounts and rates of returns and net present values. I'm not going to in this amendment, but at some point in the future, I may introduce a bill or may even ask the full committee or subcommittee to hold a hearing on the social cost of carbon and how it's calculated and how in the world the EPA was able to just out of the blue begin to use this particular calculation with no direction from the Congress. But that's another issue, and for purposes of this day, I simply offer the amendment to the bill and would hope that we would agree to it.
Gentleman, yield back.
Happy to yield back.
Chair would recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The underlying bill mandates a skewed analysis of important EPA rules by requiring DOE to pretend that the rules provide absolutely no benefits. And then the bill indefinitely delays or even blocks those rules based on that one-sided analysis. At last week's subcommittee markup, Mr. Rush offered an amendment to ensure that the benefits of EPA rules are considered in the analysis of the rules and the final determination as to whether those rules should be blocked. Many of these rules have huge benefits to public health and consumers. Mr. Rush's amendment was rejected, but the majority said the majority staff shared this new amendment with our staff, and we requested additional changes, but those changes were not made. As a result, this Republican amendment is a minor improvement to a very bad bill. I don't object to the amendment, but it does not fix the serious problems with this bill. The bill still allows DOE to veto EPA public health rules, and it still creates a costly and duplicative review process for EPA rules. Because there are no deadlines for this cumbersome process, important EPA rules can be delayed indefinitely. The amendment does not even fully address the concerns Mr. Rush raised last week. With this amendment, DOE's analysis of EPA rules still focuses on the negative factors. The amendment directs DOE to look only at any adverse effects on energy costs, energy supply, and electric reliability. That's a skewed approach that paints EPA rules in the worst possible light, ignoring the important benefits. Yet, in his opening statement, the chairman of the Energy and Power Subcommittee argued that we must pass this legislation because EPA should have done a better job analyzing the mercury and air toxic standard rule. He said the EPA underestimated how many coal plants would choose to shut down instead of clean up their toxic mercury pollution. But the chairman appears to be attributing every electric utility decision to increase the use of natural gas at the expense of coal over the last few years to the EPA rule itself. That doesn't make sense. When you talk about energy experts and the electric utilities, you learn that the price of natural gas, not rules under the Clean Air Act, has been the key factor in this transition from coal to natural gas. In fact, as the price of natural gas has increased over the past few months, the use of coal has started to increase as well. Those are called market forces, not related to regulation, but market forces. They have an impact. Every year, EPA's mercury rule will help reduce mercury pollution, prevent up to 11,000 premature deaths, deliver up to $90 billion in benefits to the nation. It's a tremendous success story that will deliver up to $9 of benefits for every dollar spent. That this rule should be the poster child for the kind of public health rule this legislation is designed to block shows just how misguided this legislation truly is. The amendment before us will be adopted, and it is an improvement because we'll be looking at some of the benefits and not just the costs. But regardless of this amendment, the bill remains deeply flawed. Nothing in this amendment changes the fact that this bill is an assault on public health and environmental protections. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Yeah, I speak in favor of the amendment. The amendment clearly says, page 2, lines 4 and 5, that the cost and benefits of the rules shall be considered and their limitations. And I think, although my colleague from California speaks kind of rosily of the analysis as performed by the EPA, my poster child for the problem is the EPA formaldehyde rule, which the National Academy of Science said that in no way could support their conclusions. And you may recall that when they came and testified, I asked whether these scientists would allow that analysis to be published in a peer-reviewed journal, and they said they would not. So the issue is that the EPA's science does not support their conclusions, but they will promulgate a rule which will have deleterious effects upon the economy, upon employment, and upon the health insurance benefits of those employees. As a physician, I know that someone's economic standing greatly influences their health. One of the primary determinants of someone's health is how wealthy they are. If they have a good job, a good benefits, they are in better health. If you have legislation which is crafted upon faulty methodology, which outside agencies strongly critique, and in the meantime it costs jobs and people lose these good benefits and lose these good wages, not only does the worker, but her family and her children, her husband, their spouse, you name it, their health statistically is prone to suffer. So if we were basing this upon great methodology, I would be a little bit okay with it. As it turns out, I do think this amendment does allow those costs and benefits of the health benefits to be considered, and also will have an independent review of just how well the EPA is doing their methodology. Lastly, I'll just say about market forces. Market forces also include the price of compliance with regulation. And so if you make a regulatory regime more onerous, then clearly that is going to factor into the market force moving from one fuel to the other.
Will the gentleman yield?
I yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just want to make a comment that Mr. Cassidy's legislation, in my view, brings real transparency to the process at EPA. Everyone keeps talking about that his amendment did not really include benefits. The truth of the matter is, when EPA does their analysis, they do an exceptionally good job of calculating benefits. As a matter of fact, they not infrequently overestimate benefits. So the mere fact that EPA already looks at benefits, and now there's nothing in his legislation that precludes this commission, that I'll call it, to look at benefits as well. And a reference was made to Utility Act earlier. And when EPA came to Congress to testify about all the benefits of Utility Act, the only thing basically that they talked about publicly was the significant reduction in mercury emissions. And yet we know from the hearings that we had that the documentation at EPA showed that the benefits did not come from mercury reduction, but came from particulate matter reduction. So in my view, they were misleading the American public. And any legislation will bring more transparency to this process, I think will be beneficial to all of us, and I would yield back to the gentleman.
Yeah, reclaiming my time, I'll also point out that there was sharp critique from public health experts exactly how EPA calculated the benefits from that particulate matter reduction. And so again, I think that this will allow that sort of, we shouldn't fear it, that transparency that will make hopefully good laws better or bad laws not able to destroy jobs of hardworking Americans. If no one else wants my time, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate my friend from Texas' attempt to add elements of my amendment that I introduced in subcommittee in order to require an analysis of some of the benefits, as well as an extensive list of costs of the EPA rules. However, Mr. Chairman, the language in Mr. Martin's amendment does not include the in-depth analysis for all of the benefits, similar and just as it does for the underlying bill as it relates to costs. And even more importantly, Mr. Chairman, the bill still allows the Department of Energy to veto the EPA rules, which again I want to remind members is absolutely unprecedented. So, Mr. Chairman, it is for those reasons that I cannot support the underlying bill, although I will support Mr. Barton's amendment. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time to the ranking member, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you for yielding to me. I just want to push back at the comments that Mr. Cassidy just made, bringing up the National Academy of Sciences review of EPA's draft formaldehyde assessment. I'm not sure why we're talking about this review in the context of the bill, because EPA's assessment is not an energy-related rule. In fact, it's not a rule at all. The draft assessment is simply a scientific analysis of hazard data. Now, the argument appears to be that EPA did not perform a thorough and scientific assessment of formaldehyde, and therefore the Department of Energy should be required to veto important public health protections. But that's not what the National Academy said. The National Academy agreed with EPA that formaldehyde exposure may cause a decrease in pulmonary function. They agreed with EPA that there is sufficient evidence of a causal association between formaldehyde and certain cancers. They also agreed with EPA that there was a causal relationship between formaldehyde exposure and lesions of the upper respiratory tract, sensory irritation, and allergic sensitization. While the National Academy didn't agree with everything that EPA found in its draft formaldehyde assessment, they did not reject EPA's basic finding that formaldehyde exposure is linked to several serious health issues, including cancer. And we should keep in mind that this was a draft assessment, and experts at EPA are still working to incorporate the review comments that they received. That's an essential part of the science-based and risk-based regulation. But in the context of today's markup, the National Academy's review of EPA's draft formaldehyde assessment does not tell us anything about EPA's energy rules, nor does it tell us anything about the methods that EPA uses to calculate the benefits and costs of its rules. And it does nothing to inform the committee about whether we should give DOE an unprecedented veto power over EPA's rules. I thank the gentleman for yielding so I can raise those points, because otherwise I think the previous statements might be misleading.
Mr. Chairman, if there's anybody else on my side who would like to, I yield to the Chairman Emeritus of the committee, Mr. Dingell.
I want to thank my good friend, and I want to tell the author of the amendment that this is said with a great deal of respect and affection. But we have a proposal here which is very bad. We have a very complex rulemaking which has to take place by EPA. First they find the health, then they find the economic consequences, and they make a number of other things. And all of this is subject to lawsuit at every turn of the road. Industry is not able to get quick decisions, and this is one of the things that's causing industry all manner of trouble, because they can't make the decisions because they don't have clarity to the process. So what we're doing here today with this legislation is adding a new level of convolution and obfuscation and litigation. The lawyers are going to love this, and industry is going to find that this is going to confuse the process still more and leave us with a situation where we're not able to accomplish our basic purposes of having speedy and efficient government operate at relatively modest cost. There's a whole new overlay of responsibilities that's going to take place under this legislation. And it so happens that already the different agencies are compelled to comment on this, and that includes the Department of Energy, which has to comment on this, to the Office of Management and Budget as the process goes forward. So what we're doing is spreading a magnificent level of confusion, affording a wonderful opportunity for there to be lots of litigation and lawsuits and trouble and difficulty over all kinds of questions, including when is there $1 billion which is given to which is going to be cost by the particular proposal. Is that over 6 weeks, 6 months, 6 years, or 60 years? Nobody knows. But we don't have any answers to those questions because we've had no significant hearings and no opportunity to learn what's going on. So the merciful thing that I can say about this piece of legislation is it's not going to become law because the Senate's not going to take it up. It is not going to be signed into law by the President. I'm sure it's
Mr. Chairman, I love Chairman Emeritus, but he's a minute and a half over.
Pardon?
I said, I love you, Mr. Chairman Emeritus, but you're a minute and a half over.
You have my apologies, gentlemen. I am so enthusiastic about this amendment that I lost control of the time.
Gentleman's time from Illinois has expired. Are there further members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. I'd like to yield balance my time, my colleague from Louisiana, the author of the bill, Mr. Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Just a couple responses to Mr. Waxman. Yeah, the formaldehyde bill is not an energy bill, but it certainly reflects a methodology. I don't think we have to be so literal as to understand the inner workings as best we can of the EPA. And there is a process by which it can be reviewed. Texas DEQ had to throw everybody on board because they were given such a short window to review. The comment period, Texas is a big state, lots of resources. They had to unwind the methodology that was used in the regression analysis, and it was very difficult, but this big state was able to do it. And so now it took them 6 weeks, but that was all the time or something like that. It was some short period of time. I don't have it in front of me. And the National Academy of Science was not so sanguine about the formaldehyde review as you suggest. I don't have that review in front of me, but I recall parts of it. The cancer that was caused was in rats. It was nasolaryngeal. And the EPA, the National Academy of Science can't deny that it caused cancer in the nasal passages of rats, but the National Academy of Science wasn't quite so endorsing that this would pose the harm to humans that EPA suggested. So in the same way, granted it's not energy, we see EPA casting out a rule which will have a negative impact upon employment, therefore people working, therefore people with wages and benefits that can pay for their health care, therefore their health, and they're doing it on something which was not transparent. Texas DEQ had a very difficult time doing this. National Academy of Science specifically criticized the lack of transparency in the methodology section, and indeed some of the conclusions were not warranted. I think it's reasonable to ask EPA to be a little bit more forthcoming in how they arrive at their conclusions, to allow that American worker whose job may be destroyed to at least know if it is valid that it should be so destroyed.
Gentleman yield.
It's his time to control.
And yield back to us my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Johnson, Mr.
I'm
Hall.
sorry, Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall, yield my time, Mr. Hall from Texas.
Thank you. I admire you for everything you said, and it's just a continuation of the assault we've had in defense against EPA, a defense we wouldn't have had we elected a different president. It said on April 12th of 2013, the Subcommittee on Energy and Power held a legislative hearing on a discussion draft of the Energy Consumers Relief Act of 2013, and it provides for greater transparency and all that, but it winds up saying that would cause significant adverse effects to the economy. That's what the EPA's been doing. That's their practice. We've proven time and time ahead. We've had testimony from people who came here testifying for the EPA that says that they'd made some mistakes. And we get a new president, we'll correct these, but this bill goes a step of the way in doing that. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Will the gentleman yield to me?
Mr. Olson.
From Texas?
Well, I sense Mr. Mr. Barton apologized for saying that you were to be compared with my cat. Well, I will.
Well,
My cat's still mad about that.
the ranking member in the spirit of bipartisanship, sure. I yield balance my time to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you for yielding to me. I just want to say that in this demonization of EPA, Mr. Cassidy is raising the National Academy to great stature. And I agree, the National Academy has great stature. I just want to remind my colleagues, the National Academy has said that climate change is a serious issue. It's a threat to this planet. It should be a very high priority. So if we're going to look to the National Academy for guidance, let's recognize where they have a very clear position urging us to take action. In the area of formaldehyde, I don't think their position was nearly as clear as Mr. Cassidy would suggest, and EPA is still working on that draft. Now, if EPA had a time limit in which they had to make a decision, maybe they could make a decision on a flawed draft. That would be one of the problems when you put deadlines and then deem something approved. We're going to have that in a few minutes on another bill. But I just wanted to point that out because I have a great respect for the National Academy of Science. And I also have respect for the work that EPA is doing. If EPA were not doing its job, the health of the American people and the cost to all of us would be dramatically increased. And it's not just rats, it's humans that get cancer, and our studies, as the doctor well knows, may well be on rats because we can learn from what's happening with them what will also happen to us. Thank you.
Chairman's
yield
time
back
has
Bounce
expired.
time.
Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment from the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, the ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentleman from California, Mr. Waxman.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to the committee print of H.R. 1582, offered by Mr. Waxman of California.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is straightforward. It eliminates the bizarre provision in the bill that gives the Secretary of Energy the unprecedented authority to effectively veto EPA public health rules. Under this bill, if DOE determines that a rule would cause any, quote, significant adverse effects to the economy, end quote, EPA would be blocked from finalizing the rule. It makes no sense to allow DOE to veto EPA public health rules, especially since the veto would be based on macroeconomic analysis that is outside of DOE's area of expertise. This is a broad assault on key public health rules. If this bill became law, important clean air and clean water protections would be at risk. The terms in the bill are so expansive and so vague that nearly every major public health standard would be affected. Now, last Congress, the House voted 145 times to block EPA rules. That's more times than we voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. The House voted to block EPA regulation of mercury and other toxic pollutants from power plants and incinerators. The House voted to strip EPA of authority to set water quality standards. And the House voted to overturn EPA's scientific finding that carbon pollution endangers health and the environment. That's, by the way, a finding that the National Academy of Sciences made as well. None of these assaults on EPA was enacted. They all died in the Senate, so now the majority is trying a new approach, give another agency veto power over EPA rules. Well, this bill would set a terrible precedent. If we give DOE a veto over EPA, where do we stop? Are we going to give the Commerce Department a veto over the Department of State, or the CDC a veto over the FDA? This bill is a recipe for making the federal agencies as dysfunctional as Congress has become. No one should want that. The DOE veto is not consistent with the stated purpose of the bill. We keep hearing that this bill is about having DOE perform an independent analysis of EPA rules. But this bill goes far beyond that. It will indefinitely delay a host of future EPA rules while DOE performs analyses in consultation with 6 other agencies, and then DOE would be authorized to actually block EPA rules. The regulatory analysis process established by the bill would be duplicative. EPA already examines the costs and benefits of its rules, and that analysis would be subject to extensive interagency review. DOE would then participate in this well-understood and thorough interagency review process. Any concerns DOE has about a potential rule can be addressed in that process. They can give their views to EPA. In fact, that's how DOE's concerns are addressed today. We don't need to create an unprecedented veto power for DOE. The result would be a costly and duplicative parallel regulatory review process. That's a waste of taxpayer funds. Do we want more government bureaucracy? That's what this bill would accomplish. This bill has serious flaws, but the DOE veto tops the list. So my amendment simply eliminates this provision. It says DOE would not be able to veto an EPA proposal. I have yet to hear any proponent of this bill explain why it makes sense to empower DOE to veto another agency's rules. The American public wants serious legislation focused on solving real problems, not mere political messaging bills with no prospect of becoming law. So I urge the adoption of this amendment to eliminate this unjustifiable DOE veto authority. And if nobody wants my time, I'll yield it back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Thank you, and I'm going to yield quite a bit of my time to the subcommittee chairman, Mr. Whitfield. Well, we just need to put things on the table. Mr. Waxman is correct in the intent of the bill, and the reason that we're offering or supporting the Cassidy bill is that EPA has almost unchecked authority under current law to propose and implement these rules with no real requirement that they conduct any kind of a cost-benefit of analysis. Now, and I wasn't in the committee when the original Clean Air Act was passed, and the Clean Water Act and all those, but at that time, when they were passed, we had rivers that were catching on fire, and there were clear and obvious current present dangers to the environment and to some of the industries and groups that were polluting. That's not the case today. This specific issue that some of us are concerned about, CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, they're running models 300 years in the future and using the most esoteric variables to come up with negative consequences if we don't reduce CO2. But it's not a clear and present danger today. And so the Cassidy bill clearly states, let's put a check on the EPA. Let's have the Department of Energy, whose secretary is going to be appointed by the same president who appoints the administrator at the EPA, and require, if the rule costs $1 billion or more, there has to be a real analysis and an independent evaluation of that rule. Now, you can't sugarcoat that. Most of the majority of this committee thinks the EPA is out of control. A fair number of the minority thinks they're not out of control, but even some on the minority side thinks there ought to be some check on the EPA. If you accept the Waxman Amendment, there's no reason for the bill. Now, that's a good thing if you're in the minority, apparently, but it's a bad thing if you're in the majority. So, you know, this is one of those, it's kind of a fish or cut bait deal. If you think the EPA is always right and they're always fair and they always, you know, they're just blessed by the Lord to always take everything into account, then support the Waxman Amendment and then vote against the bill. But if you think the EPA could be perfected, and it wouldn't be a bad idea to have an independent analysis, in this case the Department of Energy, then reject the Waxman Amendment and support the underlying bill.
Gentleman yield.
Let me yield to Mr. Whitfield first, and then if there's time, I'll certainly.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding. And once again, this really is about transparency. And of course, the Waxman Amendment would actually strike the provision that gives the Department of Energy the opportunity to overturn or prohibit the regulation. But one theme that comes through consistently whenever EPA comes up to testify in Congress, we know that they calculate the benefits very well, the health benefits and so forth. But when we ask them questions, do they ever estimate the cost, even the health cost, of the impact of families who lose jobs because of regulations put out by EPA? The answer is no. So all the Cassidy bill does is he gives the Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Labor, Small Business Administration an opportunity to meet together to analyze the impact on jobs, loss of jobs, the gross domestic product, the effect on the economy. And I think that with this EPA being the most prolific in history under this administration, this simply provides a more balanced, transparent approach. And that's the whole purpose of the legislation, and I see nothing wrong with it to have a more balanced approach. And I would yield back your 9
I'm to you. Mr. Waxman's welcome to my last 4 seconds.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. My friend, Mr. Barton, said that the EPA has, quote, unchecked ability to issue rules, and yesterday in his opening statement, the chairman also said that this legislation will finally put some interagency checks and balances on the EPA. And I just wanted to counter that statement because it overlooks the existing review process for rules. Every single EPA rule is scrutinized up and down by numerous federal agencies, as well as the key stakeholders and the public. Let me explain. Under current law and practice, EPA must meet numerous statutory and administrative requirements for economic impact analysis and public review of proposed rules before they're finalized. For economically significant rules, the EPA must provide the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs at OMB with an assessment and, to the extent possible, a quantification of the benefits of the proposed rule, such as benefits to human health, and the costs of the proposed rule, such as the cost of complying with the regulations and any adverse effects on employment. The EPA also must assess the cost and benefits of potential alternatives to the proposed rule and explain why the proposal is the preferred alternative. The EPA compiles all this information into a regulatory impact analysis, which is issued for public comment as part of the proposed rule. These analyses are extensive. The analysis for the mercury and air toxics rule is 510 pages long. The analysis for the new Tier 3 rule is 532 pages long. Other statutes that apply to EPA rulemaking include the Paperwork Reduction Act, which requires federal agencies to collect information from entities in the least burdensome way, the Regulatory Flexibility Act, and Small Business Regulatory Enforcement Fairness Act, which requires federal agencies to assess and minimize the impact of a proposed rule on small businesses and other small entities. The Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, which requires federal agencies to assess the effects of their regulatory actions on state, local, and tribal governments and the private sector, and numerous executive orders pertaining to the impacts of federal rules on particular populations. According to the GAO, these requirements are, quote, clearly voluminous and require a wide range of procedural, consultative, and analytical action on the part of the agencies, end quote. In addition, OMB manages an extensive interagency review process to allow other agencies, including the Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, to comment on EPA rules prior to their proposal and finalization. EPA must submit its rules for broader public comment, giving key stakeholders and concerned citizens the opportunity to weigh in. EPA then has to respond to those comments when finalizing the rule. So the EPA rules go through numerous layers of public review and interagency review as required by law and executive order. And in these times of budget cuts and sequestration, I am surprised that my Republican colleagues are calling for yet another government analysis. It's wasteful and duplicative, and it certainly is not true that the EPA has an unchecked ability to issue rules. And as my colleague and the Chairman Emeritus says, it's also very expensive, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a brief comment. First, I want to thank my colleagues for all the well wishes for my absence last week, thus proving a second time that Republicans do have heart. I do want to thank the cards and comments provided. On the subject matter, on the duplication and the wasteful spending, you know, there's nothing novel about having other agencies review other agencies' work, especially when they have expertise. Especially, EPA itself has veto authority, so I'm assuming that if veto authority is bad, we ought to take the veto authority away from the EPA that it has for Section 404 permitting, which can block or even retroactively veto an Army Corps wetlands or dredging permit, as occurred in the Spruce Mine matter. Also, EPA has authority to put on hold major proposed actions being reviewed under NEPA review by referring them back to the Council on Environmental Quality if EPA believes that the proposed action is, quote-unquote, environmentally unsatisfactory. So, I mean, it's just like the National Academy of Science debate. There's sometimes when we like it, there's sometimes when we don't like it. There's sometimes when we dislike veto authority, but if the EPA has veto authority, then we kind of like it. So I think if the EPA has some veto authority, then we ought to give the Department of Energy and the like some veto authority. And with that, I yield back my time.
Mr. Chairman, would the gentleman yield?
I would yield to Mr. Hall.
Yeah, I think we ought to remind the gentlelady that just spoke about review after review they've done of the EPA to tell them how to act and how to keep their policy on the right side of the road, and that they've been scrutinized and been scrutinized. Yes, they have. They've been scrutinized by something that you forgot to tell us about, and that's a review that you didn't mention, review by the courts, and the courts have reviewed them. And I think that some of us on this committee now ought to feel a little guilty, because back when we wrote the Clean Air Act, Mr. Dingell was chairman here, Mr. Waxman was here, Mr. Barton probably was here, but we put EPA into that act, even those of us who were on the energy side of the bill, because we thought even the energy people needed some supervision, but we also thought they needed fairness. And that's what they haven't had. This bill requires that, and requires them to take some position other than a position that causes adverse effects to the economy. And that's what excuse me, EPA is very guilty of. It's been pointed out many times, and there'll be some changes in the future in this when we get the right people to make the final decision. I yield back.
Gentlemen, and seeing no other members, I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Yield back. Other members, the gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, I support Ranking Member Waxman's amendment. My Republican colleagues claim that this bill is about improving transparency at the EPA and the rulemaking process there. But if that was the intention, this bill really misses the mark, because under current law and practice, EPA already must meet numerous statutory and administrative requirements for economic impact analysis. Though the economic analysis of proposed rules before they are finalized. For major rules, EPA must assess and, when possible, quantify the benefits of the proposed rules, such as the benefits to human health and the environment, and the costs of the proposed rules, such as compliance costs and the effects on economic productivity and employment. EPA then compiles this information into a regulatory impact analysis, which is issued for extensive public comment as part of the proposed rule. But now this bill says, on top of all of that, we're going to create a new, confusing, and arbitrary process that duplicates the transparent and rigorous process that already exists. The bill requires the Secretary of Energy to complete yet another analysis. But does the bill require the Secretary to disclose the methodology? No, it doesn't. Does the bill require the Secretary to solicit public comment on the analysis and respond to those comments? No, it doesn't. The Secretary then must use the analysis to determine whether or not the rule will have significant adverse effects on the economy. And if the Secretary decides yes, then the rule is blocked from being finalized. In essence, the bill gives the DOE the power to veto critical EPA rules that protect the environment and human health. But the veto is subjective. It's arbitrary, and this kind of process is really unprecedented in administrative law today. The bill gives the Energy Secretary's opinion more weight than the requirements of the Clean Air Act, the requirements of the Clean Water Act, the requirements of the Safe Drinking Water Act, and other cornerstone environmental statutes. When you pull the curtain back on this bill, what it does, in essence, is it's a way for my friends on the other side of the aisle to directly undermine and attack the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, and other environmental statutes. Mr. Waxman's amendment would strike the veto power from the bill. This amendment doesn't even get to that duplicative economic analysis under his amendment. That would remain, but at the very least, it would not allow the Energy Secretary to veto EPA rules, to nullify EPA rules by fiat. So I urge my colleagues to support Ranking Member Waxman's amendment. And I'll yield to the gentleman from California.
I thank the gentlelady for her courtesy. I'd like to address a claim that I believe was made, or implied anyway, by Mr. Barton, that the environment may be okay now and we don't need any new rules. I represent part of the Central Valley of California. We suffer from very poor air quality. Now, what does that mean? That means our children have asthma. It means our public hospital rates are exceedingly high. It affects families, it affects jobs, but especially the children. And so my constituents and I deeply appreciate EPA rules that are currently helping reduce air pollution in the valley. If this bill becomes law, that improvement could come to a direct halt, and I think it'll hurt too many people, including members of my own family. So I support the Waxman amendment. I think it's going to make this bill not acceptable, but at least it'll make it better, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I yield back to the gentlelady.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Be happy to yield to the
Yeah, a couple things, just working backwards. Of course, the problem in the Central Valley, as I understand it, is pesticides trapped in the atmosphere. This actually wouldn't touch that. This was actually just for energy. Secondly, the Barton Amendment, Ms. Castor mentions, doesn't include benefits. The Barton Amendment specifically includes benefits, so it would include the benefits that were out there. Lastly, the problem with the EPA economic analysis is so often it's considered specious. So they claim job growth from their regulatory environment. The manufacturers came in and spoke about that and just said it's not true. We're not going to create more jobs. To paraphrase John Marshall, the power to tax and the power to regulate is the power to destroy. And those employers said these are destroying jobs. I yield back. Thank you for your lenience.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Are there other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seen?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my friend, Mr. Martin, and my friend, Mr. Whitfield, made some statements that were both alarming and stunning all at the same time. My friend, Mr. Martin, mentioned that there are no impacts to climate change. What could be more absurd? I object to that statement, Mr. Chairman, and I believe that the American people will also strongly disagree with that statement. Mr. Chairman, I'm sure that the farmers in the Midwest and across the country who have lost record crops last year, I'm sure that they will disagree with Mr. Barton and Mr. Whitfield. The firefighters who have been battling the record wildfires over the last year and a half, they would disagree. The families and the communities of the 19 firefighters who lost their lives recently, they will disagree. And I know that the families in New York and in New Jersey who witnessed and are still in the midst of recovering their homes and their lives, in fact, from the devastation of Hurricane Sandy last year, they would disagree. The difference between what the majority side looks at it and what the minority side's viewpoint is that the minority side sees all of these record extreme weather catastrophes, including heat waves, wildfires, crop losses, hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding. We see these things, and we implore the committee that has the primary jurisdiction and the Environmental Protection Agency to do what we were all elected to do, to act and to act now. Texas is drying up. Who knows? 100 years from now, Texas may be another desert. I'm sure Mr. Barton would not want to see Texas to be reduced to a desert. Let's act now. The majority party sees all of these record-breaking extreme weather events, and they say, stick your head in the sand, ignore them. You know, their climate doesn't have any effect on that, on these things. You know, let's not deal with the issues. Let's go out and attack the same agencies, the very agencies who have immediate authority and legislative prerogatives to try to deal with these problems. They're the only ones that can lead the charge to mitigate these disasters. So why don't we just handcuff them? Why don't we just take their budgets away from them? Why don't we just limit their power and limit their authority? Why don't we just ban them? Why don't we just eliminate the agencies altogether? You know, well, I think that would do the American people great disjustice and disservice. So I don't get it. What don't you get about climate change? When are you going to ignore, why are you going to continue to ignore the sciences? And not only the science, but the evidence. The evidence is before us almost daily, week by week, in the headlines of the news, the lead stories on the television, day by day. So I'm not going to stick my head in the ground, and I don't think those of us on the minority side are used to trying to breathe with our head under the ground. And that might be, if we follow your advice and follow your direction, that might be the safest place in the country to protect our heads is under the ground. Are you a man?
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from New Mexico, Solana is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And there's just some areas that I wanted to offer some thoughts of what's happening in New Mexico with some of the ideas that have been suggested, that we're at a different time, that rivers aren't burning any longer, and that our communities are not being plagued with impacts that we're seeing before us. I'd invite my colleagues to travel with me to New Mexico or to Arizona, to parts of Colorado, where because of the devastation of drought and the impact of climate change are devastating our forests, costing lives. And the further impact that we're having is not just when the fire is burning, but after the fire is put out. For those of us that live in these mountainous areas, we're dependent on these watersheds up in the mountains to be able to provide nourishment to the rest of the community, and not just the communities that live at the base of those mountains and those watersheds. The agricultural communities that are downstream and downriver who are now going to be carrying the suit and the devastation and changing these waterways in so many of these communities. Why can't we take a look at that and understand that when we say rivers aren't burning, maybe not in some parts of the country, but in my part of the country, they are. We also have the impact from decades of neglect with individuals in New Mexico who are dying today because of various kinds of cancer and kidney disease as a result of being exposed to different elements when they were working in uranium mines. Stuart Udall moved forward some legislation years ago that provided support to impacted workers. And Senator Udall, right now, Tom Udall and myself have a piece of legislation called the Radiation Exposure and Compensation Act, which would bring recognition to these individuals that continue to work in these mines based on the previous legislation from 71 until present. People won't sign on to legislation because they say it costs too much. Had the EPA been doing the work that we're now saying that they will not be able to do because of concerns of impacts on human health, how many other individuals would have been devastated? When I look at these Navajo elders, these women in the eyes, and they look at me and they say, Ben, are people in Washington waiting for us to die so that the problem goes away? Is my response to them now, don't worry. We're going to send a review of a rule that could change someone's life to the DOE to review. And it may address your problem, which we know it won't. And then, Mr. Chairman, the other thing that I can't seem to get my arms around is this legislation is going to send to the Department of Energy a review of the EPA's rulemaking and then a report to the Congress. If my recollection serves me correctly, last week or the week before, we voted on an appropriation bill pertaining with the Department of Energy, and the allocations that were set up for that appropriation markup based on the Republican Paul Ryan budget were dismal. If I'm not mistaken, the Department of Energy was gutted. So who's going to do this work that this bill would be sent to do? After the message that we sent with the markup last week is to the Department of Energy, you've got a lot of fluff over there. We're going to cut you. We're going to gut you. So that may help me, Mr. Chairman, with understanding how that work will be done. And then lastly, when we're saying that climate change is not real, and or some are, I wouldn't say that. And we refuse to even consider holding hearings on different reports and studies that have been put together. I would just like to remind the body that back on May 23rd of 2011, Ranking Member Waxman and Mr. Rush requested a hearing based on two studies, one of which we've talked about the National Academies of Sciences a little bit today, on a report that was entitled America's Climate Choices, looking into these areas. And so, Mr. Chairman, I just hope that we don't forget about these individuals that are dying in New Mexico, that are dying in Arizona, that are dying in Colorado and Utah based on the infections that came out of these exposures, these lives that have been taken, associated with fire, and the devastation that's going to be caused, and the cost to the economy. The cost to these businesses that are now going to be put out of business, because where are they going to get this water with the devastation of fire, and no one's going to still help to go out and protect these watersheds. Mr. Chairman, I hope that we don't forget about those people when we work together, and I strongly encourage my colleagues to support the Waxman Amendment. Thank you. You're back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seen none. The vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Billrockus. Mr. Billrockus votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Miss Eshoo. Miss Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes aye. Mr. Welsh. Mr. Welsh votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally. Up. Gentleman from Mississippi.
Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 19 ayes and 30 nays.
19 ayes, 30 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Sir, what number is your amendment?
Number one, amendment number one.
Amendment to the committee print of H.R. 1582 offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
The amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment will prevent the Cassidy bill from blocking and delaying EPA rules that save consumers money at the pump by exempting these important rules from the bill's unprecedented intrusion into EPA's rulemaking process. Mr. Chairman, this bill could prevent EPA from adopting rules that protect consumers even when the benefits of these rules are enormous. For example, the EPA and the Department of Transportation has issued rules for model year 2012 to 2016 cars and trucks. These rules will save consumers, on average, more than $3,000 over the life of a vehicle, save 1.8 billion barrels of oil, and reduce carbon pollution by 960 million metric tons. The agency rules for 2017 to 2025 cars and trucks will also increase the benefits to American families. In 2017 and to 2005, consumers will save more than $8,000 over the life of a vehicle. The nation will save 4 billion barrels of oil and will reduce our carbon pollution by 2 billion metric tons. Mr. Chairman, these are precisely the kinds of rules that we need. Yet, if EPA tried to propose these rules with the Cassidy amendment in place, the rules would, the Cassidy bill in place rather, the rules could be blocked from ever going into effect. That wouldn't make any sense, as these rules are supported by every automobile manufacturer in our nation. As a matter of fact, Mr. Chairman, the General Motors CEO, Dan Atkinson, called these rules, and I quote, "a win for American manufacturers for the very first time," end of quote. These EPA rules are expected to save consumers more than $1.7 trillion in fuel costs and will reduce America's dependence on oil by more than 2 million barrels each and every day. That's more than our country's combined imports from Saudi Arabia and Venezuela together. Mr. Chairman, this committee needs to do what's best for all the American families and consumers. Blocking these EPA rules will harm the environment and could increase the fuel costs for consumers, which is exactly what we can expect if this bill goes into effect and prevents EPA from making further improvements to our vehicle standards. The President's Climate Action Plan calls for new heavy-duty vehicle fuel efficiency standards for model year 2018 and later. As with the EPA's previous rules, these new heavy-duty vehicle standards will likely receive broad support from industry, reduce fuel consumption, save Americans money at the pump, and increase the efficiency of moving goods across our nation, which would have an additional economic benefit for consumers. But these improvements may be delayed or never even occur if this bill, the Cassidy bill, becomes law and prevents the EPA from adopting new rules. EPA's vehicle standards are important rules that save consumers money and are a win for both the industry and the environment. Subjecting these rules to unprecedented delays and potential DOE vetoes under the bill would be a step backward and would harm both consumers and environment, and will really reveal how backwards the full committee, the majority side, is on these particular issues. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to protect American consumers by voting for my amendment. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Time has expired. The chair would recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I rise in a very respectful way to oppose the amendment of our gentleman from Illinois. All of us obviously support saving money on gasoline. And I don't think there's anything in this legislation that would preclude that. First of all, as we all know, it applies only to rules that exceed $1 billion in cost. And it specifically says on page 4 that one of the things that the Secretary of Energy with his other members would have to look at would be the impact on consumer prices. So if the gasoline price went down, obviously that's not going to be something that they would want to prevent a rule from taking place. On the other hand, if a rule is adopted affecting the way automobiles are manufactured to meet certain mileage tests, and let's say that costs go up dramatically, and as a result of that, sales go down, and as a result of that, they start laying off auto workers at the manufacturing plants, and let's say they start losing their health care and their children start going hungry, and it reached that state, then the whole purpose of this bill is this transparency to look at the impact on the overall economy, the impact on the jobs, the impact on the consumer prices, the impact on GDP. So it's simply a balancing act. And for that reason, I think that because if gasoline prices go down under this legislation, there's absolutely no reason for the Department of Energy to try to intervene. So I would respectfully request that members oppose the gentleman's amendment, basically because in this specific instance of gasoline, it's really unnecessary. And with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendments? Gentlelady from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support Mr. Rush's amendment, and just want to spend a couple of moments to talk about why. First of all, this bill threatens to block or indefinitely delay important energy-related environmental rules, even when those rules will create enormous economic benefits. I think that this is bad economic policy, I think it's bad energy policy, and I think it's bad environmental policy. The EPA and the Department of Transportation's tailpipe standards and fuel efficiency rules provide substantial benefits. They help consumers save money at the pump, reduce reliance on foreign oil, and reduce the carbon pollution that is threatening our climate. Under EPA's car and truck rules, by 2025, Americans will be able to travel twice as far on a gallon of gas, which will save consumers thousands of dollars at the pump over the life of a new, more efficient vehicle. The savings to American consumers will be equivalent to a drop in gasoline prices of $1 per gallon. This is significant savings. We're also talking about rules that are supported by all, let me repeat that, supported by all of the major auto companies, including Ford, GM, and Chrysler. These rules will cut U.S. emissions of carbon pollution by 6 billion metric tons, which is more than the total U.S. emissions of last year. In short, these rules are good for American consumers, manufacturers, and our environment. Like Mr. Rush, I'm concerned that the bill could prevent EPA from adopting new vehicle rules that save consumers even more money and continue to address the threat of climate change. The President's Climate Action Plan calls for new standards for heavy-duty vehicles, which are the second largest source of carbon pollution in the transportation sector. Current standards for these vehicles are projected to produce $49 billion in net benefits, and future standards would build on these gains. Now, why would we want to stand in the way of that? These are measures that would save consumers money, but under the bill, they would be at risk no matter how large the benefits. It doesn't make sense. For instance, DOE does not have the capability to do the macroeconomic analysis required under Section 3 of the bill, nor does the agency have the resources to develop that capacity. If DOE is unable to conduct the economic analysis, then EPA would be legally prohibited from ever finalizing its rule. Never mind that the DOE analysis is parallel and duplicative to analyses that EPA already completes when it develops regulations. But maybe that's the underlying ideology of the bill, where you either hobble an agency so that they can't do anything, and then say that it's dysfunctional and it can't operate, and that it's a bad agency. I mean, maybe that's really what should be written in the staff analysis. I'm also concerned that the bill could undermine the existing rules for light-duty vehicles. Although the bill applies only to future rules, the light-duty vehicle rule requires EPA and the DOT to conduct a midterm review by 2018 to ensure that the rules are working properly. If changes are needed then, no matter how minor, this bill could delay or obstruct the entire program. So this not only threatens the substantial consumer benefits of the rules, but undermines the certainty that automakers need to build the fuel-efficient cars of tomorrow. This bill is fundamentally flawed. I'd just like to close with the following observation. I've commuted across the country every week since I was first sworn in as a member of Congress. I wouldn't be elected unless there were Republicans that vote for me. And let me just say to you that the Republicans in my congressional district ask me every week, what's happening to the GOP? These are policies that are driving people away from you. Our country, America, I've always said, is the best idea that was ever born. It's because we're never satisfied about the progress that we've made. We want to make even more progress. I think the Grand Old Party is working very hard to relegate itself to the dustbin of history. These are bad policies for our country, bad for consumers, and bad for the future of our country. And it really makes me very sad that in this distinguished committee that we're taking up bills that take us back to a time when we didn't know any better instead of making progress. With that, I yield back the balance.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment. Those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed will say no. No. Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Lance. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Billrakis. Mr. Billrakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes aye. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Members wishing to cast a vote. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance.
Mr. Lance votes no.
From Mississippi, Mr. Harper.
Mr. Harper votes no.
Louisiana, Mr. Scalise.
Mr. Scalise votes no.
Pennsylvania, Mr. Pitts.
Mr. Pitts votes no.
Mr. Walden, Oregon.
Mr. Walden votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote.
Mr. Chairman.
Someone from Texas, Mr. Green.
Mr. Green votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, how is Dr. Burgess recorded? I heard a voice, but I didn't see.
Dr. Burgess was recorded.
I heard a voice coming out of somewhere.
Dr. Burgess is recorded as a no.
It was his voice.
It was his voice.
I hear it myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know that voice.
Dr. Gingrey.
Mr. Gingrey is not recorded.
Votes
Mr. Gingrey votes no.
Other members wish. Mr. Braley from Iowa.
Mr. Braley votes aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 21 ayes and 28 nays.
21 ayes, 28 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to the committee print of H.R. 1582, offered by Mr. Tonko of New York.
The amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My Republican colleagues argue that this bill brings needed transparency to EPA rules. If this bill was really about transparency, I would have no problem with it. But that's not the case. This bill will block or indefinitely delay EPA rules that are critical to protecting human health, the environment, and our climate. It adds yet another duplicative layer of analysis to an already exhaustive regulatory process. The legislation bars EPA from issuing a final rule until the Department of Energy completes its duplicative analysis of this rule, and if applicable, makes its subjective determination as to whether the rule would cause significant adverse effects to the economy. The bill sets no deadline for DOE to complete this study or to make its determination. This appears to eliminate any statutory or judicial deadlines for the issuance of rules. This bill would likely result in the indefinite delay of critical EPA rules, and the bill allows the Secretary of Energy to block the EPA rule for good. These delays and vetoes would have real-life, tangible impacts on human health and the environment in our United States. Let's look at a couple examples of the types of rules that would be covered by this bill. If this bill had been law, EPA could have been delayed or blocked from finalizing the mercury and air toxics standards, which set emissions limits for new coal and oil-fired power plants for mercury and other toxic air pollutants. EPA estimates that these new standards will save up to 11,000 lives, prevent 130,000 asthma attacks, and avert 540,000 missed work or sick days each year. In addition, it would reduce children's exposure to mercury, which is a powerful neurological toxin that is retained in our bodies and can cause developmental delays and loss of IQ. This bill would certainly apply to EPA's recently proposed Tier 3 vehicle emissions and fuel standards program. More than 150 million Americans still breathe unhealthy levels of air pollution. Motor vehicles are a significant source of this pollution, especially in our urban areas. EPA has proposed to lower the permissible sulfur content of gasoline, which would allow vehicles to operate more efficiently and pollute less. EPA estimates that this rule would prevent 22,000 asthma attacks, 2,400 premature deaths, and some 1.8 million lost school days, work days, and restricted activity days each year. These are human health benefits that could be further delayed or perhaps permanently lost if this bill were to take effect. The EPA rules potentially blocked by this bill are especially important for the most vulnerable amongst us, our babies, our kids, and our seniors. My amendment simply states that this bill does not apply to EPA rules that would reduce the incidence of cancer, premature death, asthma attacks, or respiratory disease in children. If my amendment passes, EPA's rules will still receive extensive examination and review. They will be subject to a robust interagency process. They'll have to withstand all applicable notice and comment requirements. The Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs will review their rules and their adherence to all requirements of law and regulatory policy, and they'll be analyzed with state-of-the-art economic tools pursuant to executive order. After this exhaustive process, I would hope that we could all agree that children shouldn't have to wait for the Secretary of Energy to complete a redundant economic analysis to be able to breathe clean air or play outside without being exposed to cancer-causing pollutants. Failure to issue regulations not only jeopardizes human health and our environment, it can harm the economy. This legislation fails to recognize that fact. Perhaps if the agencies overseeing our financial system had issued a few more rules, the banking system would have not required an extensive bailout and we wouldn't be struggling to recover from a self-inflicted economic wound that cost us billions. My amendment will make it clear that EPA can continue to issue rules that protect children's health, as the Clean Air Act empowers the agency to do. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Chair will recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I seek recognition to oppose the gentleman's amendment. Obviously, the hearings that we've had on EPA regulations, and we've had a lot, and we all recognize that there are many benefits in regulations implemented by EPA, particularly as it relates to premature mortality, asthma attacks, incidence of cancer, and so forth. And we all obviously support regulations that minimize those types of diseases and impacts on health care, particularly of children, the most vulnerable in our society. But having said that, I do oppose the amendment because the legislation introduced by Mr. Cassidy simply says that the Department of Energy, working with Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Labor, Small Business Administration, after the initial report, will determine what the impact of that regulation will be on the overall economy, the impact on consumer prices, the impact on jobs. And we've had so many hearings through the years, we all know that poverty has a dramatic impact on the health care of anyone suffering from poverty. And we know that regulations sometimes cause plants to shut down. We know that very well relating to coal and the coal sectors. And when you go to the communities where they rely on certain activity, economic activity that is impacted by these regulations, and people lose their jobs, people lose their health care, people lose the ability to provide money for their children to be educated, they suffer as well. And the thing that is so disappointing is that time after time after time, when EPA comes to testify, they say we never consider the impact on the families of the people who lose the jobs. We never consider the impact of the health care that they lose, the health insurance that they lose, and the impact that that will have on them. So all this legislation does is it gives another opportunity to explore in more detail the impact on the families of those people who lose their jobs. It's not an either or, but it's a let's look at it in the balance. Let's look at the benefits that the EPA has set out, but let's also consider the economic impacts and the impact that that has on health care as well as other things. And so we're not directing the Department of Energy Secretary to do anything except if he determines with the other members of the Obama administration that that particular regulation affecting a cost of at least $1 billion will have more of a detrimental impact than will be a benefit, then we want to take some action on it. So with that, I would yield back the balance of my time and respectfully request that members would oppose the Tonko amendment. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really want to think through that argument that was just made to us. In effect, the gentleman from Kentucky is arguing that if somebody in the coal area loses his or her job, their children might become poor. And if they become poor, that could adversely affect their health. Therefore, we're not going to let an EPA regulation to protect children elsewhere, and maybe even in Kentucky, from being protected from pollutants that cause children diseases like asthma and cancer and everything else. Now, that's a very strange ethical balancing, because we're saying that the potential life of a child in a family that has a job that may be adversely affected by a regulation should take precedent than children who are already poor. Now, poverty, of course, isn't the only thing at stake here. Even kids from middle-class families have asthma. Even kids from wealthy families can get cancer from exposure to air pollutants, especially toxic air pollutants. So who's going to do this ethical weighing? Well, one could say maybe what EPA proposes will make a lot of sense, and we'll want that regulation. But it can't go into effect until we have a very long process of DOE doing the analysis. And DOE presumably is going to do an analysis speculating on the impact of families in the coal area if coal is adversely affected. But wait a second, what if coal is not adversely affected? What if the regulation simply requires the coal people to use some retrofit equipment, use some anti-pollution devices, which, by the way, will give jobs to families who produce those anti-pollution devices? I think we ought to factor that in because the kids from those families will be benefited, presumably. So I just really ask you to think through the ethics of this. I know you represent, I know the chairman of the subcommittee, I speak to the chairman. Mr. Chairman, I know the chairman of the subcommittee is concerned about his constituents in the coal industry. I'm sure people in Congress were very concerned about the people they made horse and buggies. I know that people in the Congress didn't want slavery eliminated because it was the basis of their economic foundation. But that is not should not be what guides us on national and ethical policy. So I just want to express my concern at the disjointed ethical analysis, because when you finally get to agreeing that the regulation makes sense, not that everybody's going to be happy and not that everybody's going to come out on top with it, but overall the benefits heavily outweigh the costs, which is what EPA does before they can issue a regulation. And if they don't come up with that, they can be sued and it could go to court to decide whether they've acted lawfully. And there is OMB that has to review what the agency at EPA decides. Again, looking at all of this economic analysis. But I just think that the American people ought to hear this argument and decide if they want their family's health put at risk because the potential of what might happen to somebody in Kentucky or some other place if the coal industry had to spend more money to reduce the pollution that causes poor health. And it's not just carbon, although that's really what's on the minds of the people on this bill. They don't want carbon pollution regulated. That's what they don't want EPA to do. But EPA also regulates air pollutants that are otherwise very harmful. And I mean harmful. Toxic air pollutants that cause birth defects, neurological problems, in addition to asthma and all the other things. So this amendment applies to kids. I think if you care about kids, you don't stop EPA from going forward after they've done their thorough analysis with regulations that protect kids' health. And I would hope members would support the amendment by the gentleman from New York.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman.
Recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield to my colleague from Kentucky, Mr. Whitfield.
Well, I thank the gentleman from yielding, and just in response, I don't think that there's anything in this legislation that would allow the Department of Energy to just look at one state, the impact, say, on Kentucky of a rule. It requires a much broader national analysis of the impact nationwide on a number of different factors. And the gentleman from California, who I have a great deal of respect for, did make a good point. Some of these regulations do require coal plants to put in additional equipment, and that creates some jobs, and that's very good. But what about those regulations of which there are some, of which the technology is simply not available commercially to meet the emission standard? What about in that situation where it's not available? There's no way it can be done. And what about the impact that that has on people who lose their jobs and their health care and their education opportunities? So that's really all that this is about. And I would yield, would the gentleman mind yielding to Mr. Cassidy? Thank you.
Yeah, a couple things. This argument seems very duplicative. We seem to be going around and about on this time after time. First, let's just say it doesn't have to be a long time that it takes. Texas DEQ came back on that formaldehyde, which granted was not energy, but it shows that it can be done in a very complicated, untransparent methodology and figured it out within several months. And it's kind of a specious argument that we're going to somehow sacrifice the health of children, because clearly the DOE secretary has the ability to consider the benefits. That was the Barton Amendment. And as regards the transparency, I'll say once more, there is concern that EPA overstates benefits, and that is concern that came from testimony from public health physicians and other officials before this. And by the way, it is not just the coal industry which is affected. It is any energy-intensive enterprise. Now, it may be in Santa Monica, beautiful beach. I'm very familiar with the area. It doesn't have blue-collar workers. But our problem with employment right now is blue-collar workers. Not just mining, but manufacturing and construction. And manufacturing, if it's a steel plant, if it is energy intensive of some other sort, requires energy. So we may think, oh my gosh, all we're doing is affecting the people of Kentucky. That doesn't matter to us. But we're also affecting auto workers and steel makers. The reason that so many plants moved overseas, of course we can't compete with China or India's labor costs, but we can with their energy costs. When our energy costs go up, they move overseas because then we can't compete on anything. When our energy costs are down, then they come back. We're seeing a renaissance of energy-intensive enterprise, which is to say jobs for families who are blue-collar and otherwise underemployed. Now, I will say, one of the benefits of this is for those families to allow them to go back to work, good jobs, good benefits, and that does improve a family's health. With that, I yield back.
Will the gentleman yield to me? Thank you very much for yielding. Look, EPA regulates and does an analysis, and they look at the benefits and they look at the costs. And if the benefits outweigh the costs, they go forward with their regulations, subject to OMB review, subject sometimes to court review. But what we're really talking about is carbon. Because otherwise, when EPA regulates, they have to use the best available control technology. And look at the history of the Clean Air Act. Adopted the first time when Nixon was president, revised when George H.W. was president, Bush was president. The enormous gains from the Clean Air Act of reducing pollution came about because it drove the development of technology to reduce those pollutants that affect adversely public health. And I just think that, let's be honest about this debate. What the Republicans are saying is don't let EPA regulate carbon emissions that cause greenhouse gases, that cause climate change. And I was very moved by the statement from our colleague from New Mexico, Mr. Lujan, when he talked about people being affected every single day by the carbon emissions in the air. And these are emissions that stay in the air for hundreds of years, and we're going to let more be added. And the Republicans are being members of the Flat Earth Society by denying the science, refusing to hear from the scientists, and now keeping EPA from regulating. So that's really what this is all about. And don't give me this business about the poor kids of families that may be displaced. I don't agree with that argument. I think it's ethically invalid.
Gentleman's time from Kentucky has expired. Gentlelady from California, Ms. Capps.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to register my support for Mr. Tonko's common sense amendment because it protects our children's health and lives from pollution. I think we should be clear about the effect of the underlying bill. The bill will block or delay EPA public health protections opposed by certain industry certain industry interests. But the problem is that the public doesn't want more pollution. The public doesn't support weakening the Clean Air Act or the Safe Drinking Water Act. The public does not support blocking specific public health standards, such as EPA's requirements that coal-fired power plants clean up their toxic mercury emissions. Now, the other side tried to block that rule, and many others in the last Congress, but those bills never went anywhere in the Senate. Yet certain industry interests still want to block EPA regulations, so the majority is trying another slightly subtler approach here. This bill creates new hurdles for EPA to jump over in order to clean up air pollution, and it makes an end run around most of the environmental laws administered by the EPA. For many important rules under the Clean Air Act and other statutes, if the Department of Energy isn't able to complete the analysis required by this bill, the rules will not be able to be finalized. That's just a slow death. And the DOE has little expertise and no resources to do this macroeconomic analysis, so the prospects do become bleak. For example, the Tier 3 regulations to clean up gasoline will prevent an estimated 22,000 asthma attacks per year. Those regulations will avoid almost 2 million lost work days and school days due to illness. They will prevent premature deaths from heart attacks and strokes triggered by air pollution. Not just a few deaths, but over 2,000 per year. And yet, if this bill became law, the Tier 3 regulations may never become final. So I don't think we should pretend that this bill is about transparency or more analysis. This bill is about the same thing as so many bills that were promoted in the last Congress, stopping EPA from doing its work of protecting the public from pollution. Our colleagues across the aisle say this is not the intent of the underlying bill. They claim they don't want to block rules that will protect kids from pollution. But this amendment by Mr. Tonko gives us a clear choice. This amendment provides for an up or down vote on our children's health. Mr. Tonko's amendment ensures that EPA can finalize rules to reduce the incidence of cancer, premature death, asthma attacks, or respiratory disease in children without the cumbersome DOE process. Mr. Tonko's amendment says that when it comes to health and the lives of our kids, we are going to let the EPA do its job. Of course, every EPA rule will still have to go through the lengthy public process, rigorous data requirements, extensive economic analysis, detailed interagency review, and opportunities for legal challenges. These already apply. But despite all the misleading rhetoric we have heard today about the need for still more in economic analysis, we actually have a very simple choice to make. We can protect polluters, or we can protect America's children. I urge my colleagues to make the right choice, support Mr. Tonko's amendment. I yield back, or to someone else who may wish time. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to point out that nothing at all in the underlying bill states, blocks, stops, even addresses anything about health. It talks about something we need to be talking about, and that's poverty and the effect about jobs and the EPA has. And indeed, they've come before a committee before and said that's not something they pay attention to. Well, we want to make them pay attention to what that does. In May, more than 130 employees at PBS Coal in Somerset County, Pennsylvania were laid off. Third round of layoffs in the company in less than a year. Last week, nearly 400 people was announced would lose their jobs on First Energy by shutting off the Hatfield and Mitchell coal-fired power plants in Greene and Washington County, Pennsylvania, after the company spent nearly $1 billion cleaning them up. They joined about 5,000 other coal miners who lost their jobs in 2012. And it won't just be miners. They're losing their jobs. It's the Boilermakers who are no longer building and maintaining power plants, thousands of laborers, electricians, operating engineers, steam fitters, plumbers, carpenters, machinists, all out of work. They'll be joining those that joined manufacturing in Millersburg, Kentucky, were laid off in March, or Peoria, the hundreds of Boilermakers there laid off of work. Erie, Pennsylvania, where GE is laying off 950 workers at its locomotive power plant because less coal means less work for the railroads. These men and women are out of work because of the country's 600 coal plants. More than 20% of all coal-fired units are being shut down due to EPA regulations. Now, I'm not one to talk much about my family, but I want to talk about growing up in poverty. Because I remember what it was like to come home to an empty refrigerator, growing up with my 10 brothers and sisters, my mom and dad both working long jobs all the time to try and feed us. And I remember in part motivated by that when I went to college at Wheeling Jesuit University. I oftentimes joined groups to travel throughout Appalachia, helping families in the bleakest kind of poverty you can imagine. In coal towns that were once thriving, but as the mines shut down, miners lost their jobs. And that went through not only in West Virginia, but Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, Kentucky, Illinois, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, where the poverty is still so bleak in parts of eastern Kentucky that it's absolutely amazing, 3 times the national poverty rate. And when people grow up in poverty, even despite whatever things may come out of the health care bill, they characteristically have more drug abuse, dental problems, chronic depression, cancer. They just can't afford food. They can't afford to live. We see that such families have depression, twice the rate of the rest of the population, higher rates of asthma and obesity because of poverty. Now, here we're talking about that even when things get better in some kids that don't have mental health problems, a recent study by Georgetown University says that they'll have other risks for obesity and cancer and hypertension and stroke and cardiovascular disease because of the stresses of poverty and unemployment. Now, I'm with my colleagues. We want to make sure we're looking at health, and the EPA does a lot of talking about that. All we're asking is these for Americans who are out there who are going to be told they're going to lose their jobs as power plants are shut down, as coal mines are shut down, and towns move back into incredible, unspeakable poverty. I ask you to look at the eyes of the people who are in poverty of all ages, the young, the old, the in-between, and make the EPA look at their eyes as well. I don't give a rat's tail if they don't have the people right now to do it. They certainly have enough people to come up with some other things. They step into the area of the Department of Energy. Somebody ought to speak up for Americans who are losing their jobs and saying, as regulations come through, we ought to find out how poverty affects them, how they can't even afford to live in decent trailers, how we have to send charitable organizations down to put a roof on their house, put a toilet in their house, give them running water. Why are we afraid to talk about those things? I can't imagine why anybody would vote against an amendment that says, we want to know what the EPA is doing to put more people in poverty. So what are we going to do? Offer them more food stamps, more welfare, more money for their schools, more other things there? Why not give people the decency of a job and say that when we come up with these regulations, why can't we talk about the effect this has upon jobs, the effect this has upon families, the effect this has upon the future of children, and the struggles they have, and the hopelessness that they have, and the depression they face, and the worries that they have. Let's be compassionate and get back to these issues. And stop talking about the politics of either side on this, and for once and for all, make the EPA and other federal organizations say, we want to know about your war on jobs and the effect upon children. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentleman from New Mexico.
Mr. Chairman, if the committee would indulge, I'm going to share a very personal story, and one that I hope doesn't get too emotional. We talk about the impact of this and what Congressman Tonko's legislation would do to look at rules that would result in reduced incidence of cancer, premature mortality, asthma attacks, respiratory disease in children. My father growing up was an iron worker. My dad had all the pride in the world. He got up early in the morning. We had an old beat-up pickup truck. Sometimes it would start, sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes Dad had to thumb his way to work. Fortunately, he had brothers that worked with him in his trade that would give him a ride and pick him up and take him to work. Mom would pack him his lunch, and we didn't have much growing up, but Dad always found a way to leave a piece of that tortilla, half of that apple, whatever it was in that lunchbox, and whichever one of his 4 kids would meet him at the driveway when he got home, he'd share that with them. It was a big treat. My father died from lung cancer December 18th of this last year. And so when we say legislation doesn't matter, or to adopt legislation that's going to save someone's life, it doesn't matter, come look at my mom in her eyes and tell her it doesn't matter. my father's grandchildren and great-grandson. Tell him and them it doesn't matter. Look, if this amendment is something that everyone can agree to, and there's a thought that there could be $1 billion cost to something that would impact the prevention of cancer in this legislation, which doesn't outline a timeline, which I hope at least the majority Republican will fix. It doesn't say $1 billion over a year, $1 billion over 10 years, $1 billion over 100 years, $1 billion over 1,000 years. Why wouldn't we do that? And look, Dad's exposure came through him working at a national lab. But the next step with this is to connect it with how the Occupational Safety and Hazard Association or organization works from a safety perspective with the Act, with the EPA, to enforce these, to make sure that these things that we're breathing in aren't going to kill our families. Furthermore, those individuals around the Navajo Nation, this study that came out from them in 2008 cost more than $1 billion. These individuals who suffered from a berm that broke in Church Rock, New Mexico, on the Navajo Nation of a chapter, where there was a big berm that was collecting all these tailings and this liquid waste that came out of the mines. Had rules been in place then to prevent that berm from breaking, at the same time that there was a meltdown on 3 Mile Island, which received more attention than the Navajo Nation, what would happen to these communities? And so should this have been delayed to go in and help these individuals, these families that are dying of these illnesses every day? These communities that have been devastated, that what company is going to move in where contamination ran through nuclear and uranium contamination ran through a river from New Mexico to Arizona? Who's going to move in there? And who's going to clean it up? The federal government sure hasn't been keeping track with this. So all I'm saying is, I know that this conversation is emotional, and it should be. But there should be some areas where the Republican majority and the Democratic minority can find some common ground, especially in areas where we're going to address this issue. And lastly, if I could just try to make sense of the economic argument that is being made to prevent the passage of this amendment and that ultimately defeated the last amendment, that looks at the economic impact of not addressing climate change and the cost of denying climate change even exists. More natural disasters, more hurricanes that are stronger, more tornadoes that are even more devastating, more firefighters that are causing severe impacts to our watersheds, and the impact to that water that's making its way to these businesses, more respiratory ailments and cancers that are caused, sounds to me like it costs a whole lot of money. And I know we can put dollar amounts on what has happened over these last few years. We should look at the understanding what the economic impact is of not doing anything to address climate change. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, we get to that point. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Other members wishing to speak? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment. Those in favor of the Tonko amendment will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not.
Mr. Chair, I call for a recorded vote, please.
Roll call vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hall, Mr. Barton, Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes no. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes no. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Billrakis. Mr. Billrakis votes no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long? Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers? Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Waxman? Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Pallone? Mr. Rush? Ms. Eshoo? Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette? Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle? Ms. Schakowsky? Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Matheson? Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Butterfield? Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow? Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui? Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Christensen? Ms. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney? Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Braley? Mr. Braley votes aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Lujan? Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko? Mr. Tonko votes aye. Chairman Upton?
I'm sorry, votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote, Mr. Pallone?
Mr. Pallone votes aye.
Mr. Walden?
Mr. Walden votes no.
Mr. Hall?
Mr. Hall votes no.
Mr. Welch, are you
Mr.
recording?
Welch is not recorded.
don't?
Mr. Welch votes aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 19 ayes and 25 nays.
19 ayes, 25 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? Seeing none, the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 1582 as amended to the House. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The bill is agreed to. Roll call is requested.
Mr.
And
Hall.
we'll have the clerk call the tally. All right.
Mr. Barton. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes aye. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise votes aye. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Billrakis. Mr. Billrakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Chairman Upton.
Votes aye.
Chairman Upton votes aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Mr. Hall.
Mr. Hall votes aye.
Anyone else? Mr. Rush.
Mr. Rush votes no.
Any other members wishing to cast a vote? Mr. Shipkiss, are you voted? The clerk will report the tally. Seeing none.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 25 ayes and 18 nays.
25 ayes, 18 nays. The bill as amended is approved. H.R. 1582 is favorably reported. The chair now calls up H.R. 1900 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 1900, to provide for the timely consideration of all licenses, permits, and approvals required under federal law with respect to the siting, construction, expansion, or operation of any natural gas pipeline projects.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point, so ordered. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pompeo for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1900, offered by Mr. Pompeo of Kansas.
And without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said in the subcommittee hearing and indeed in the markup last week, this legislation, H.R. 1900, is a common sense approach at providing certainty for natural gas pipeline developers. And even more importantly than the developers themselves, this legislation ultimately helps alleviate the increasingly prevalent natural gas pipeline capacity issue that's plaguing parts of the country, especially the Northeast. Ultimately, though, this is a pro-consumer piece of legislation. It will provide lower energy costs for consumers all across America by providing the infrastructure we need to get energy to where the demand centers are and where working families need that energy. One of the benefits of having the legislative hearing and the subcommittee markup is that we got a chance to hear again from some of the stakeholders with different ideas and suggestions. As a result of that, I'm offering this amendment in the nature of a substitute that incorporates many of the suggestions from folks who testified, as well as folks on the other side of the auditorium here today. First, it does three things, really. First, the substitute amendment applies this legislation only to projects that go through the FERC pre-filing process. That's an extensive review beginning up to 8 months before applications are even filed with the commissions. We learned from FERC and other witnesses that the pre-filing process is a successful process that keeps all stakeholders, including state, local, and federal agencies, as well as property owners, informed and involved with the project from the very beginning. It also allows pipeline developers to incorporate additional environmental mitigation measures into their process as they move through application and ultimately construction. Second, as a result of the testimony of Commissioner Moeller, we learned about his concern with FERC's 12-month shot clock and when it would start. As originally drafted, the shot clock began right after public notice. After hearing his concerns that were shared by some on this committee, specifically the timeline that Mr. Moeller said that the timeline was achievable if we made this modification, we changed the start time to when FERC actually receives a completed application that is ready to go as defined by current regulation. And then finally, the third substitute provision maintains the statutory requirement that the permit will go into effect absent agency action, but makes some small changes to that process as well. It requires agencies, when seeking a 30-day extension to the 90-day deadline, to certify that they're unable to complete their work and be forced to deny the permit as a result of that time period. This was something that folks on the other side were concerned about. So now, as a result of these changes from pre-filing to final permit reviews, the substitute puts in place a process that lasts over 2 years. That include 8 months of a pre-filing process, 12 months for the FERC certificate, 90 days for the agency to take final action, 30 days for an extension in the event the agency says they need more time, and then 30 days after the permit goes into effect for agencies to add additional terms and conditions. I can't see how anyone could think that over 2 years is not moving fast enough, or they're putting an undue burden on agencies to complete their task along that timeline. We've tried hard. I worked with folks over the last few days to try and accommodate all their concerns, and we've tried to put together a truly bipartisan bill and a common sense update to the gas pipeline permitting process. I urge all members to support this substitute amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there amendments to the substitute? The gentleman from California.
Strike the last word.
Gentleman strikes the last word.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, there's an irony that this bill should be offered following the last one that was just passed, because the last one said we don't want to trust EPA as an agency to make decisions. We want those decisions reviewed by the DOE. But this amendment says that FERC can stand in the place of all the other agencies that would have to do a review in their area of specialization. For example, the Bureau of Land Management would look at rights-of-way through federal lands. for a project that FERC, let's say, wants to agree to. But this amendment says, no, FERC can have that power, not the BLM. BLM can advise them, but FERC is now going to make that decision. FERC will be figuring out water discharge limits. FERC will be determining which technology should be employed to reduce air pollution emissions, not EPA, but FERC. FERC will be issuing permits to protect wetlands and even bald eagles. These are jobs that FERC doesn't have the expertise or the resources to carry out, but we're going to let FERC do it. Looks like FERC has a lot of goodwill on this committee if we agree to this bill. But we don't really trust FERC that much either, because the underlying bill says after FERC has completed application and they're doing their analysis, they got to act within 90 days. And if they don't act within 90 days, then the permit goes automatically into effect. Now, we heard from a career director of the Office of Energy Projects at FERC who testified he didn't believe this bill would result in faster permitting. He told us that the bill could actually result in slower permitting if agencies have no choice but to deny applications because of the arbitrary deadlines established by the bill. The amendment that's now before us seemed like it was cobbled together to try to find solutions to some of the issues that were raised, but it doesn't deal with the underlying problem, which is that permits are going to be granted in 90 days, even if the agency is not ready to make that decision. I know this amendment, which gives FERC the role of being a super permitter, does some good things, but that is troublesome. It acknowledges that forcing agencies to approve or deny permits in 90 days could result in agencies simply denying the permits. The amendment provides agencies another 30 days if they otherwise be forced to deny a permit. That doesn't solve the problem. For permits that require longer than 120 days to complete, permits can be detailed documents with terms and conditions to protect public health and the environment. It can take time to work out these details, but the underlying bill says we don't have any more time. FERC, you just make all the decisions and make them in 90 days. Maybe we'll give you a little bit more time, but that's it. So I don't think this Pompeo amendment solves the problems with this bill. I still will oppose the bill, and I know the amendment offered as a substitute will become the basis for other amendments that we'll be considering, and we'll hear about those amendments later on. The bill is fundamentally flawed, and I urge opposition to the bill. I'll be happy to yield whatever. Yes, to Mr. Green. Balance of my time.
Thank my colleague for yielding, and I want to use this opportunity to thank Ms. Pompeo for working with us and a number of us who had concerns and still have concerns about the bill. There were two issues that this amendment addresses. The last one is one that deems it approved, and some of our members who aren't on the subcommittee, where I come from in Texas, we deal with FERC and pipelines literally every day. I've never not lived on a pipeline easement in Houston. And they were having problems with FERC over the last decade, but in the last few years there hasn't been. And dealing with a lot of these companies, I have not had one complaint from a company because of the regulatory delay at FERC. And my only concern about it is that there are some good things in this bill, and particularly the two amendments that Ms. Pompeo put in. But by putting this deemed approval in there, it's the kiss of death into the United States Senate. It'll pass the House floor, but it will go nowhere in the Senate. So that's why I have some concern about the bill, and I intend to vote against it, even though there were some improvements with this amendment. And I yield. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Ranking Member, for your time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Are there further amendments to the substitute? Seeing none, gentleman from Illinois seeks recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I do seek recognition. I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman has the amendment at the desk. Clerk will report the title of the amendment. What number?
Number 2.
Number 2?
Number 2.
number 1.
Russian Amendment number 1.
Clerk.
To the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes. Before he starts, let's just make sure this is the right amendment. Just come on up and we'll make sure. Is that the amendment? Is that it?
I do.
Yeah? Is that it? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, this is the correct amendment. Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize for the confusion that I'm involved in 2 simultaneous meetings at the same time as most members have been. But, Mr. Chairman, my amendment strikes the section of the bill that provides that permits automatically go into effect if agencies do not approve or deny the permits in 90 days. At the hearing last week, Mr. Chairman, no one could explain how this provision will work, as these permits aren't yes or no decisions. These permits can be detailed documents that need to be written by the agencies, and it doesn't make any sense to mandate that an unwritten permit will automatically take effect. Mr. Chairman, we received technical comments from some of the agencies whose permitting processes would be affected by this provision. And here's what the agencies responsible for implementing these laws told us. The Army Corps of Engineers stated, and I quote, "This legislation could allow certain activities to proceed despite potential adverse and significant impacts to aquatic resources and without appropriate compensatory mitigation," end of quote. The EPA stated, again a quote, "It will severely limit states' abilities to ensure that discharges comply with water quality standards," end of quote. The EPA also told the committee, another quote by the EPA, "This requirement could potentially result in sources receiving an inadequate permit or permit that does not assure compliance with the Clean Air Act," end of quote. The Bureau of Land Management and the Fish and Wildlife Service raised similar concerns. Mr. Chairman, the Pompeo Amendment seems to acknowledge that this provision would be unworkable, but it would make the provision even more problematic by apparently requiring FERC to write and issue the permits of other agencies. That will require FERC to duplicate the expertise of the EPA, the BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Army Corps of Engineers. And Mr. Chairman, as you know just as well as we know, that is just not feasible. Even if it were feasible, it will require an amazing dedication of new personnel, new resources, to duplicate the functions of all of these federal agencies at a time when my Republican colleagues are in fact cutting funding to many of these same agencies. Mr. Chairman, attempting to transform FERC into some kind of a super permitting police agency would be a mistake. It is a bad idea that has not been thoroughly thought out. This automatic permitting provision could have serious environmental consequences, and it could result in permits being issued that are inconsistent with the requirements of the nation's environmental laws. Mr. Chairman, agencies should act expeditiously on pipeline applications, but they also need time to perform their due diligence by conducting the necessary environmental and safety reviews. They must be able to set appropriate terms and conditions to protect the environment and the public health. And clearly, the permits should meet the underlying statutory requirements. Mr. Chairman, I urge all members to support my amendment, which will address a major problem with this bill. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kansas, recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I move to strike the last word and respectfully oppose the Rush amendment. Where to begin? First of all, you know, he says that my amendment acknowledges that this bill is unworkable. That's not true. It doesn't. It's not unworkable, but you don't have to take my word for it. You can take Commissioner Moeller's word for it, the man who will be forced to implement this. Commissioner Moeller said if you get the shot clock right and start the clock at the right time, we can absolutely do this. So I don't know what some staff person at FERC might have said or might not have said, but the commissioner, the one who chose to come testify, and we invited a number of commissioners to come testify, but the commissioner who chose to come testify said that this was eminently workable if we would finish that shot clock provision. We've done that, and so this bill is easily workable. Mr. Chairman, both Mr. Waxman and Mr. Rush suggested that this is giving FERC some greater power, that we're taking away authority from EPA or BLM or DOI. Nothing could be further from the truth. We are completely respecting those agencies. Indeed, we give FERC no authority that would have otherwise been granted to them. We haven't changed their statutory duties, obligation, rights. All we're saying is that we'd respectfully ask you to do your job and to finish and complete the process. We're not taking any power away from them. If they think that a particular pipeline shouldn't be built because they've got environmental concerns, they ought to come articulate that, present that, and deny the permit. All they've got to do is act. This seems like a pretty straightforward proposition, a basic governmental function. You know, we also have heard now folks talk about letters that were submitted. We had a hearing on this, invited a number of agencies to come testify before this committee on this bill. If they had concerns about it, if they thought it was going to cause their agency problems, they were invited here to come testify. None of them chose to show up, save for one commissioner from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Last thought. There's been lots of talk about how this deemed approved provision is radical or unheard of or unprecedented. But that's just simply not true. This is not the first time we've had laws written that anticipated the need for certainty in permitting our applications and granted approval if an agency did not act. There are lots of examples. I'll just read a couple of them. Indeed, in the Clean Water Act itself, at 33 U.S.C. 129, that deals with the state certification of projects, it says if the administrator does not approve or disapprove such application within 45 days of receipt, the application shall be deemed approved. We're not breaking new ground here. In TSCA, Section 5, dealing with new chemical approvals, if EPA does not take action on a pre-manufacturing notice, the manufacturer of the chemical can begin manufacturing the chemical. The company must submit a notice of commencement to EPA within 30 days, after which the chemical is considered an existing chemical. It's been deemed approved. The Pinelands National Reserve, 471I, dealing with approval of comprehensive forage management programs. The same thing. Should the Secretary fail to act on the proposed plan within 90 days, the plan shall be regarded as approved. I could go on, but my time is winding down. Look, H.R. 1900 follows in this tradition. It asks just a simple thing. It says, EPA, BLM, DOI, knock yourselves out. Do your job, but you can't wait forever. You can't leave folks who need energy, who need affordable energy, waiting for you to act. Do your job, finish the application process, make the review. And what you'll be approving is not some blank piece of paper. It's not some nothing, not some vacuum. Commissioner Moeller made very clear. This is a workable bill. They know precisely what they'll be approving if these agencies don't complete their task. And for that reason, the amendment by Mr. Rush, I'd urge my colleagues to vote against it. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion on the Rush amendment? The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Last week, I introduced an amendment to require GAO to study what, if any, delays there have been or may be in the permitting process. The committee chose not to adopt that amendment, which was friendly, and so I'm going to be forwarding a request on that study from myself to the GAO. My good friend, Mr. Barton, has indicated that he will join me in signing the request, and I look forward to hearing back from him and other members who might wish to sign. The harsh fact of the matter is there's a basic rule of life, and that is if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We have found no problem here. I am not opposed to constructing natural gas pipelines. I think they should be constructed, but carefully and safely. And I would remind my colleagues when one of those things lets go, it's like an atom bomb. And there are considerably different situations with regard to whether the permitting should be permitted in different places and under different circumstances. And I would point out that Commissioner Moeller last week says that 90% of the permit applications at FERC are already approved within 12 months, and that the delays on the remaining 10% are due to complexities of the proposed projects or incomplete applications. What is he telling us? He's telling us that they then are going to either approve in haste, they're going to disapprove in haste, they're going to act without proper time to consider a significant number of applications that need to be considered in connection with the permitting process. If there is a problem here, we don't know what it is. All we know is we got a piece of legislation before us that is going to encourage the agencies to move faster. But one of the reasons that we give the agencies time is they have to give notice to the people so that the people can make the necessary comments and can point out that there are perils here, or there are reasons why they support them, or reasons why they oppose them. This is going to constrict that notice, because that notice is defined now in the administrative procedures and in the other statutes that affect the issuance of permits of this kind, not only by the agency that issues the permits with regard to the pipeline, but also with regard to agencies that issue permits with regard to endangered species or water pollution or air pollution or other things. And those are oftentimes extremely complicated questions and require the time be given the people so that they can make the necessary comments on the peril. We had a situation where a bunch of natural gas got loose in pipelines, or rather from a treatment process in Cleveland during World War II. It cost, during that time, in those dollars, it cost $300 million to Cleveland. Just literally blew hell out of Cleveland. And it got into the sewers and basements and everything else, and it caused incredible destruction. When one of these pipelines goes up, there are serious consequences. But that is not the only concern we have here, because we are concerned about the impact on the environment, on whether or not it is going to pollute the waters or contaminate the air or cause other difficulties or endanger the different species that are endangered under the law. And so this encourages nothing less than carelessness, haste, and doubtful behavior without proper opportunities for the citizens to see to it that they are heard and to give the process an opportunity for it to work. I think we have a lot of questions. What delays have there been, and what has caused them? How do we fix identifiable delays in issuing permits? What effect appropriations and other resources have on FERC and other federal agencies that have to deal with these particular problems? We have no decent factual record here to justify enactment of this legislation or even its consideration. It may be there is something needed here to be done, but the record doesn't show it, and there's no reason to proceed on this kind of legislation. The amendment is a very helpful one, and I commend the gentleman for offering it. But when you put lipstick on a pig, you still got a pig, and the lipstick doesn't help. So I urge the adoption of the amendment and the rejection of the legislation.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes just to make a comment about this amendment. I did want to simply point out and just clarify that during the testimony of the FERC Commissioner, Mr. Moeller, they talked about 90% of the certificates were completed within 12 months. And that is true, but that relates only to the control that FERC has. They have control of the certificate process, but they do not have any control of the other agencies, and that's one of the purposes of Mr. Pompeo's bill, is to put some time constraints on those other agencies. And so the 90% did not refer to approval of permits per se, but of the certificate in their process. And with that, I would be happy to yield to the gentleman from Illinois.
Just for a minute. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What's going on in the country right now, also on the whole pipeline debate, is that this natural gas is going to flow to places where it needs to go, whether you believe in the climate change debate and you want to have electricity, and there's a limited amount of pipelines. And so what it's doing is pushing crude oil or refined product out of these pipelines. So there's also a disruption in the transportation fuels of passenger vehicles. And so if you're all in, as I am, on fracking and really getting a chance to really develop this natural gas boon that we have to have the infrastructure to move the natural gas, whether that is to power plants, whether that is to chemical manufacturing facilities, whether it's LNG terminals or the like. And so that's why I'm pleased to support my colleague, Mr. Pompeo, and really follow up on Chairman Whitfield's comment, is that the FERC is one thing, but there's a lot of other agencies that this whole process has to go through, and this bill is intended to get the job done, get it done right, but in a timely process so that the energy disruptions based upon transportation doesn't cause great distress to this country. And we've seen what's happening in the movement of crude oil. We want to move natural gas through trains. We want to move other things through the like. Pipelines is the safest, most secure route to transport commodity products, natural gas, and liquid commodities. And we should be about the safety mechanism, but also the timeliness, so we can take great advantage of this opportunity that we have in this country. And I thank my colleagues, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back to me, and I yield back the balance of my time. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, anyone who is truly concerned about the expeditious approval of pipelines across America should support the Rush Amendment and oppose the underlying bill. Because what we heard in the Energy and Power Subcommittee and what is contained in the legislative record, if you will go back and review the testimony, is that the underlying bill will likely lead to greater delays in the approvals of pipelines. Chairman Emeritus Dingell is absolutely correct. There was no compelling case made through the testimony in the legislative record. The testimony from the career director of FERC's Office of Energy Projects confirmed that the 12-month time limit may actually lead to more pipeline delays, contrary to the sponsor's stated purpose. The nonpartisan staff witness testified that he did not believe H.R. 1900 would effectively cause pipelines to be permitted any faster than they are now, and that if FERC must deny applications that cannot properly be reviewed within the time period, quite possibly it could take longer for certain projects to be approved. And then what will happen is they'll have to refile and start over. The legislative record also contains the fact that 90% of these pipeline projects are approved within 12 months. So the ones we're talking about that take longer are the more complex pipelines. And in order to ensure that the safety of the public is protected, there's this natural give and take that happens among agencies. Do you move the pipeline maybe certain yards one way or the other? Do you look at other alternatives? That's the natural give and take that leads to more expeditious approvals. Also, it is likely that if you say within 90 days something has to be approved, you're going to be doing so in contravention of environmental statutes. You want to delay a project, do that, and allow the environmental litigators to take up the cause and take a pipeline project into court. I think that the underlying bill runs counter to the author's intent. I think it's going to lead to greater delays. It's simply not realistic for the very complex pipeline projects to say 90 days, and if it's not finished, it's deemed approved.
Will the gentlelady yield?
So I'm almost done. I'm almost done. And so I'd say, please do not approve something that is so unrealistic and will complicate the approval of important infrastructure for natural gas and pipelines all across the country. I think the Rush Amendment is a reasonable step to try to improve a very flawed bill, but in the end, whether we're able to do so appears unlikely. And Mr. McNerney from California had asked me previously to yield time, so I'll yield to the gentleman from California.
Thank you for the courtesy. And I understand my friend from Illinois, Mr. Hemskis, would like to see product move, and I think we all feel that way. There's a natural bottleneck because of the increase of natural gas, but pipelines are being permitted. And as the Chairman Emeritus suggested, if it isn't broke, don't fix it. But I have a further piece of ancient wisdom here. Be careful what you wish for, because you might actually get it. If this were to become law, complex projects would either be denied or would be permitted without appropriate review. In either case, the result will be endless lawsuits. This is self-defeating to the underlying objective of the bill. So if you want this to move forward and be adopted into law, you're going to get a lot more than you asked for. I recommend that we pass the amendment, and I want to yield to the Chairman Emeritus if he needs time.
Observe that we finally have heard exactly what this is about. It is not so much to speed up the process at FERC, but rather it is to create an entirely new speed up of all of the other permitting processes that are going on under other laws, probably not under the jurisdiction of this committee. I thank the gentleman for yielding.
I yield back.
Does the gentlelady from Florida, well, I guess she yields back too. Is there a further discussion on the amendment? Gentlelady from, well, I'm sorry, Anna, he had his hand up before, so Mr. Engel, I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As my colleagues have mentioned, the language that really disturbs me in the bill is the deemed approved language, and I think Mr. Rush's amendment will take care of that. I really wanted to try very hard to vote for this bill, because I really do think that there needs to be some kind of finality, that these things cannot keep going on and on and on and on with delaying tactics just for the sake of delay. I don't think that helps us, this country, or helps us. However, sometimes the cure turns out to be as bad or worse than the problem. And I think to say that something is deemed approved is very troublesome. We want an adequate amount of time to figure out what the best way forward is. We don't want it to be, well, we don't want it to be endless. We also don't want to short circuit things that are very important, environmental and other things that need to be done. And as some of my colleagues have already said, it could even have the opposite effect, because agencies are forced to make a yes or no decision by a certain deadline, the language could lead them to decline permits because they need more time. So we need to allow the agencies to complete their work within a reasonable time frame. The question is, what is reasonable? I want to thank Mr. Pompeo for working with some of our offices, my office certainly on this side of the aisle during the past week to try to improve the bill, and I'm sorry that we were unable to come to a compromise language that was satisfactory for all of us, but I know there was a good faith effort to do that. So I really wanted to support the bill if possible, but it's really hard for me to do that without Mr. Rush's amendment. Changes in our discussions during the these weeks, some changes have been made in the substitute language that are good, but I still have concerns about the language in this bill that could have negative environmental effects. The approval language, again, is a specific problem, and I understand the industry's need for finality on these projects, but it really boils down to, from my way of thinking, that it really cannot be done at the expense of proper agency review of projects. It just can't. We would be going away from one problem, I think, and creating a problem that would be even worse. So let me just say that I support Mr. Rush's amendment for all the reasons mentioned, and to Mr. Pompeo, while we were unable to reach a compromise on this language, I appreciate his trying to work with us towards compromise, and I hope that in the future we can figure out a happy median here and continue to work together. I yield back unless anyone...
Did you want to yield, Ms. Eshu, or do you want 5 minutes, Ms. Eshu? Okay. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. At
Yes,
this time,
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
This time, recognize the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and as we see all over the world every day, a soldier will be helped by a sailor. I yield to Mr. Pompeo, the sponsor of the bill, as much time as he may consume.
Very kind of a Navy guy. Just a couple quick points. So there's been some concern expressed that we got it wrong, that this legislation is going to cause problems, that the author didn't get what he intended, I think was the reference. Well, it's possible that I could have it wrong, but if I've got it wrong, so does every major natural gas organization in the country. They very much want this deadline. They very much want the agencies to be put on a time period that says, do your job, get it done, complete it, be thorough, be complete, but give us an answer. So I don't think we've got this legislation wrong. I suspect, Mr. Chairman, somewhat feigned concern that there'll be denials of pipeline permits as a result of this. I think it's just wrong. I think that's not going to be the case that we're going to see, and I think Commissioner Moeller in his testimony certainly didn't indicate that. And lastly, I want to thank Mr. Engel, too. We did work hard with a number of the folks on that side. And I understand why they have some concerns about this. I listened to their concerns about the deemed approved language, but there were simply no alternatives offered that got us to a place where we could be sure that we could get finality, that we could actually get agencies to act. And so we tried and we worked. I was not presented with any other alternative that would have gotten to us a place where we would have finally gotten the agency to make sure they had to do what they were supposed to do. And finally, one last comment that I think has been overlooked. In the substitute amendment, these agencies have the opportunity to continue to offer conditions even after the permit has been granted. And then in that same vein, that means it's not a 90-day process. I continue to hear folks talk about 90 days, 90 days, 90 days. We're talking about a 2-year-long process for all the stakeholders to have the opportunity to comment and express their concerns and improve the permit application so that we get a pipeline that fits the location which it's designed to serve. The concern about 90 days misunderstands the total length of the process and the duration and the availability for input. And with that, Mr. Olson, thank you for the time.
Anybody else on my side need some time, want some time to speak? On the other side, 2:45 left. In that case, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. At this time, recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshu, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think if we're going to have a conversation about interstate natural gas pipelines, we really have to consider the safety impacts. In September 2010, in my home county, San Mateo County, California, that's the county that's just south of the city and county of San Francisco and right near San Francisco International Airport. A natural gas pipeline explosion in San Bruno, the city of San Bruno, killed 8 people and destroyed dozens of homes. I mean, the ground just absolutely erupted under these homes and burned people alive in their homes. It's one of the largest pipeline disasters in our country. And this bill rushes the permitting process, and that puts people at risk. I don't know if the author of the bill took any of this into consideration, but it's a real one. It's a real one. That community is still struggling to cope with the overwhelming disaster that took place there. Now, at the subcommittee hearing on this bill, the Pipeline Safety Trust testified that they oppose the bill. They oppose it because an important part of FERC's process is an analysis that includes engineering and safety issues. So I don't think I don't think we should be short-circuiting that process. A rigid 12-month deadline for FERC's analysis, I think, is a mistake. Most frankly, I don't think life is that tidy. It would be wonderful if it would fit into that tight time frame, but I'll tell you, after what we witnessed in our county, safety really can't be pushed aside. Now, some complex projects will take more time than that, and I think that that's a very important consideration here, and we should allow FERC to take the time it needs to get it right. Because again, if any kind of safety is sacrificed, this is real world. This is not some dry language buried inside of a whatever number page bill. This has real impacts. People depend on FERC and the other agencies to do a careful job to ensure that, that residents living near pipelines or right on top of them are protected. And that's why I really want to raise this issue of what happened in my county. It was a real disaster, a real disaster. And I would want to see this happen any place in our country, much less any place in the world. But we're talking about the United States, and this is not some rural region. This is right adjacent to San Francisco International Airport. In fact, when the explosions took place, the very early reporting was that they thought a giant airliner had crashed because it was, I mean, the sounds and all of it were seemingly related to that. Instead, it's the pipes underneath those homes that just absolutely blew them sky high and the residents in them. Luckily, many of the residents were picking up their children from school, and otherwise their lives would have been taken, but they lost their homes anyway. So I want to raise this, Mr. Chairman, again, because it's a real life issue, and I don't think the legislation really, let me just put it this way. It worries me a great deal that the legislation is not sensitive to the whole issue of safety. I don't think it's covered in the underlying bill. So with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there further members wishing to speak on the amendment? Seen none. The vote occurs. Gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't take up the full 5 minutes, but Mr. Chairman, the Rush Amendment addresses a very problematic provision in this bill, and I support Mr. Rush's amendment and thank him for it. Under the Pompeo substitute, if an agency cannot complete its review of a permit application by the arbitrary 90 or 120-day deadline, then FERC is required to automatically, and I think that's what we're talking about, to automatically issue this permit. This broadly applies to the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, the Coastal Zone Management Act, and even rights of way through federal lands. These permits are detailed documents that include emission limits and technology or operating requirements and conditions to ensure the environment is protected. Agencies need to figure out all of these details and then actually draft the permits. Under the Pompeo substitute, FERC acts as a super permitting agency. If an agency misses the deadline, FERC apparently writes and issues the permit itself. It's up to FERC to decide whether or not to include conditions submitted by the agencies with expertise, the agencies Congress empowered to issue the permits in the very first place. It makes no sense to have FERC issuing permits for other agencies. FERC doesn't have the expertise to issue BLM rights of way through federal lands or to set water pollution discharge limits. That is not a workable solution, Mr. Chairman. There are going to be real environmental and safety impacts if permits automatically go into effect without the responsible agencies completing the necessary analysis. The Army Corps of Engineers and EPA provided technical comments on the bill. They raised concerns that automatic permitting could lead to permits that are inconsistent with the requirements of the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act. This could lead to environmentally harmful water or air pollution. Automatically issuing permits without an agency confirming that the legal requirements are met is also going to increase the risk of litigation and undermine the public's acceptance of interstate natural gas pipelines going through their communities. This is a bad provision. The consequences have not been thought through, and so I thank Mr. Rush, and I support Mr. Rush's amendment and ask all of my colleagues to vote for it. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Are there further amendments? Are there further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. All those in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. And opinions
Chairman.
Roll call is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes no. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes no. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn votes no. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes no. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes no. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes no. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes no. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes no. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes no. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes no. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Billrakis. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes no. Mr. Waxman.
Aye.
Mr. Waxman votes aye. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes aye. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Rush.
Aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Miss Eshoo. Miss Eshoo votes aye. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes aye. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes aye. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen votes aye. Ms. Castor. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Braley. Mr. Welch. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes aye. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes aye. Chairman Upton.
Votes no.
Chairman Upton votes no.
Members wishing to cast a vote. Mr. Matheson.
Mr. Matheson votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote?
Mr. Cassidy votes no.
Dr. Cassidy, Dr. Murphy, have you recorded?
Mr. Murphy votes no.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Mr. Braley?
Mr. Braley votes aye.
Mr. Pallone?
Mr. Pallone votes aye.
Other members? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 17 ayes and 27 nays.
17 ayes, 27 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to the substitute? Gentleman from California. No? You have an amendment? Yes. Gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the title of the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. McNerney of California.
And the amendment will be considered as read. The staff will distribute a copy of the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Climate change is one of the most urgent energy challenges that we face today. The world's climate scientists have concluded that if global average temperatures increase beyond 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, society will face serious impacts. Just last month, the Environmental Energy Agency concluded that unless the world takes strong actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions immediately, global temperatures could rise by more than 9 degrees Fahrenheit in the decades ahead. Now, many of us do hope that natural gas will serve as a critical bridge fuel as we work to control our carbon pollution. And I agree that natural gas is now playing a crucial role in our energy supply system, but there are serious issues with natural gas. While it is cleaner than coal or oil, natural gas is a fossil fuel and it still releases carbon pollution when burned. But worse, if methane escapes without being burned, it's even more serious threat. Methane is a potent global warming gas, far more powerful than carbon dioxide. During the production, distribution, and transmission of natural gas, methane can escape from leaky equipment and pipes. Fugitive methane emissions from natural gas systems do represent a significant source of global warming pollution in the United States. These fugitive methane emissions can reduce or even negate the climate benefits of using natural gas as a substitute for coal and oil. We need to get the methane emissions under control. What my amendment states is that for an application for pipeline construction will be considered complete, and the one-year clock will start only when a company shows its project will utilize available designs, systems, and practices to minimize methane emissions to the extent practicable. My amendment does not establish any new mandatory requirements on pipeline companies. It simply states that if companies want the new deadlines to apply, they need to show they are taking common sense steps to address methane emissions. If we're going to make changes to the natural gas pipeline permitting process, we should talk about more than just the deadlines. We should also talk about the quality of the projects. Reducing methane emissions is good for natural gas companies, and it's good for our environment. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Other members wishing to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I oppose the McNerney amendment. I think it shows that it's not my bill. It's not this amendment that I proposed that's adding any restrictions or making any changes to environmental law. It's this amendment that's trying to do so. It's trying to put additional demands and requirements in place, and they're wholly unfounded. And frankly, I consider this amendment kind of be a red herring with respect to what I'm trying to accomplish here. I'm not trying to change any of the underlying rules or policies. Just tell folks to get their act together and complete the task. But opponents don't want to confront the status quo of a regulatory process failing because it allows these pipelines to remain in limbo for years. Just have to say one last time, nothing in this bill affects any existing pipeline safety standards. It's all regulated by PHMSA, which is completely unaffected by this bill. Moreover, the NEPA analysis that every pipeline application already has to go through will include estimates for such things as the fugitive methane emissions that Mr. McNerney's amendment attempts to address. Industry also has every incentive to control these methane leaks. Escaping methane is escaping product, which means losses. There are ongoing collaborations between industry and the environmental community to study new ways to deal with this issue. With that, Mr. Chairman, I urge a no vote on the McNerney amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to speak in support of Mr. McNerney's amendment. H.R. 1900 attempts to solve a problem that doesn't even exist. It seeks to speed up the approval of natural gas pipelines, even though GAO found that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for pipeline permitting is predictable and consistent and does get pipelines built. The bill seeks to change this process, even though the pipeline companies have testified that the permitting process is, and this is a quote from them, generally very good. We have real energy challenges in this country, and we should be spending our time seeking real solutions to these challenges, not on problems that don't even exist. Mr. McNerney's amendment addresses a real energy problem, the dangers of climate change and the contributions of natural gas infrastructure to this warming climate. Although natural gas emits less carbon dioxide when burned than coal or oil, the development and transportation of natural gas results in releases of methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas 25 times more damaging to the climate than carbon dioxide. This is a serious concern. According to a recent study by the World Resources Institute, leaks from natural gas systems, and this is a quote that Mr. McNerney gave, but I want to underscore it. Leaks from natural gas systems represent a significant source of global warming pollution in the United States, end quote. The study further found that methane leaks occur at every stage of the natural gas life cycle, with leaky pipelines being one of the major sources, as I can attest to with Ms. Eshu's comments about a very tragic event in the state of California. Mr. McNerney's amendment is a common sense measure to address this problem by ensuring that new pipelines incorporate designs, systems, and practices that minimize leaks and reduce climate pollution. This is precisely what we should expect and require of energy infrastructure that will be around for decades. And it makes both economic and environmental sense. By reducing pipeline leaks, the amendment ensures that more of our domestic energy resources will be actually used and fewer of these resources will be wasted. The amendment doesn't fix all of the problems associated with H.R. 1900, but it does ensure that the bill addresses an energy problem that actually exists. If we're going to revisit the laws governing the permitting of natural pipelines, this is the kind of common sense step that we should be discussing. And I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I'm finished with my statement. I can yield back to someone. I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Anyone else wanting to speak on this amendment? Seeing none, the vote occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. And opinion of the chair, the noes have it, the noes have it, the noes have it.
Chairman,
Gentleman from California.
I have an amendment at the desk. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the title of the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Waxman.
And
of
the
California.
amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman will have 5 minutes in support of his amendment, and the staff will distribute it to the members.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope this amendment can be accepted, because I think it makes a lot of sense. We're trying to solve one problem with this bill, and that's the speed by which the permits are approved. But I have an amendment that deals with another problem that I think we ought to look at and see if we can resolve. When someone is going to come in and ask for a pipeline permit and get this accelerated time frame to present their application, I think we ought to ask them to recognize that there's a problem in the law. If a pipeline operator is sending natural gas through the pipeline, but some of that natural gas is leaking. The way the system operates now is the pipeline operator charges the end consumer, the consumer who's buying the natural gas, for all the gas that's they sent through the pipeline, including the gas they never get because it was leaked. That doesn't make sense. It's not fair to the consumer, as well as being a harmful, toxic, or let's say harmful and very powerful greenhouse gas. But I'm talking about it from the point of view of the consumer. So what we would say is we want a policy that will incentivize the pipeline companies to reduce these leaks. They don't have an incentive to reduce the leaks if they can get the full price for their gas, even the gas that leaks out. But on the other hand, if we said that they could not charge for the gas that was leaking or leaked, they could only charge for the gas that was delivered, I think that makes sense. the clock doesn't start running for the new one-year permit deadline unless the pipeline company's application shows that the company won't charge its customers for natural gas that leaks from the pipeline. It doesn't require a pipeline company to do anything. I think we ought to think through the policy of requiring them to bear the costs and not pass it on, because they're the ones best able to stop that leak. But we just say you don't get advantage of this one-year deadline for FERC to decide on your application unless you're willing to accept the idea that you're not going to stick the consumer with the costs that wouldn't have otherwise occurred except by the reason of the leak itself. And I hope the gentleman from Kansas would see merit in this, and I'd yield to him, and with the hope that maybe he would accept this amendment.
Thank you, Ranking Member. And I wish I could. I very much would. I think I've been here 30 months, and I think I have voted with you a couple times, but not today. I don't think this amendment makes any sense. It's irrelevant to the matter that's before us. If we want to have a hearing on fraud in the pipelines, that they're not delivering all the product that they're supposed to, and they're telling the consumer that they're delivering something and not really getting it, or there's a contractual provision that's being violated, I think private entities have the perfect capacity and absolutely the right incentive to get that right. And so I think you've got an amendment to a bill that to this bill doesn't make much sense. It's not connected. I think it's probably a solution searching for a problem too. But in fact, you know, we've got environmental groups working with universities on ways to reduce this leakage. I don't impact PHMSA with this at all. The folks who do pipeline safety, this is a safety issue as well, I suspect you're concerned with, in addition to the economic one you proffer. And so unfortunately, I'll have to urge my colleagues to vote no on your amendment.
Well, I reclaim my time. I thought you said this is a solution to a problem that doesn't exist too, because that's what I think your underlying bill is all about. But I don't think we could solve more than one problem at the same time. We could walk and chew gum, as they used to say, under a previous Republican president. And so for solving the problem of the time frame to get a permit approved, why not say at the same time that in order to get this benefit that you're going to offer to the pipeline permittee, that they ought not to pass the charges on to the purchaser? I think it makes sense. You're not willing to accept it at the present time. I could force it to a vote, but I'm not going to do that. I just want you to think about it, and I hope this is an issue that we can deal with in another time, maybe on a bill that's going somewhere, or if this bill goes somewhere at some point, we can consider putting it on this bill. So I offer this amendment. I think it makes a lot of sense. I wish the gentleman would accept it, but it looks like he's not. But I still would like to urge people to vote for it.
Gentleman's time has expired. Other members wishing to speak on the bill?
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from, let's see, Mr. Tonko and then Mr. Barton. Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support my colleague's amendment. I was surprised when I learned that pipeline operators are allowed to charge their customers for natural gas that leaks out along the way. Right now, if a company wants to ship 100 units of gas through a pipeline and one unit leaks out, the company has to pay the pipeline operator for that lost unit. The company is basically required to donate that lost unit to the pipeline operator. The pipeline companies have an incentive to identify and fix the big methane leaks that may pose an imminent safety hazard, but they have little incentive to plug the smaller methane leaks that, over thousands of miles of pipeline, add up to a significant loss. This is an issue that the committee should examine in more detail. And while the country currently enjoys abundant natural gas supplies, that doesn't mean that we should be content to waste gas by letting it escape into our atmosphere. We need to change the incentives here. Pipeline companies should have the right incentives to make their pipelines as efficient as possible. They shouldn't be able to pass the buck of leaky pipelines on to their customers. I would hope that we all could agree on this point, that customers should not have to pay for a product that is lost in transit through no fault of their own. Mr. Waxman's amendment states very clearly that a pipeline company that wants its application considered within the one-year deadline set up by this bill must demonstrate that it won't charge customers for lost natural gas. If a pipeline company wants to continue passing on the cost of lost natural gas to its customers, it can do so, but then the bill's 12-month permitting deadline wouldn't apply to applications submitted by that company. So with that, I urge my colleagues to support Ranking Member Waxman's amendment, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Barton still requests time?
Yeah, if I'm allowed, Mr.
Gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to ask some questions of council. Who's our pipeline expert there at the table? Okay. My understanding is, in a natural gas pipeline, the owner of the natural gas that puts it into the system puts in a certain quantity, but the consumer who's going to pay for it ultimately pays on the output, not on the input. Am I correct or incorrect?
That is my understanding too, sir.
So I also understand that depending on the length of the pipeline and the diameter of the pipeline and the temperature gradient differential, the age of the pumping stations, that there is a natural loss or leakage as you go through the system, and so that in order to maintain pressure and guarantee a certain output, that you would normally put a little more in at the beginning than you expect to get out at the end. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir. Any pipeline cannot be 100% completely sealed from emissions. That's correct.
Okay. Now, having, with that information, I don't think Mr. Waxman's amendment is detrimental to the underlying basis of the bill. Mr. Pompeo is the author. He said that he doesn't see fit to accept it, and I'm going to respect that. But I would say in general that, you know, while it may not be necessary for the underlying purpose of the bill, it's certainly not detrimental, and this is something that perhaps in the future we could work with the minority on. Nobody wants a system that leaks indiscriminately, that, I mean, you know, not just from an environmental standpoint, but obviously from an economic standpoint. Natural gas is a commercial commodity, and it has value. It also, as a greenhouse gas, can be detrimental if released in the atmosphere in sufficient quantities. So you have both an economic incentive to minimize it, and you have an environmental incentive to minimize it. And both sides of this committee should be able to agree that we should work together on some amendments similar to what Mr. Waxman is.
Would the gentleman
Mr.
yield?
Chairman,
I'll certainly
Just
yield.
I thank you. I appreciate your statement. I think we ought to look at this more carefully. I think we have two issues: the consumer and the release into the air of a very potent greenhouse gas. I would ask that we continue to look at it. I'll respect the author's view that he doesn't want to put it on this bill, and so I won't put it to a recorded vote. But I would like a voice vote on it, and then, but more importantly, I want to continue to work on this issue.
Mr. Chairman, gentleman yield.
And yeah.
Oh, two. Understanding that, you know, a pipeline, and I know this is a consumer amendment, but, you know, you and I as consumers, we're not on those pipelines. They go to, if you have one pipeline, you may have 10 business customers there. And from what I understand, they meter what they take out of that pipeline. So, and there may be some loss between the production and, so, you know, this doesn't affect you and I for our gas bills that we pay at home.
Now, when you and I go to the gasoline station, we pay on what comes out of the pump into our tank. We don't pay on what the distributor put into the big underground tunnel.
Well, and in natural gas, it's the same situation. Right. But I know there's some concern about leakage along the route, and that's a pollution issue. But I agree that maybe we need to look at this, and because natural gas, we hope because of our success, will be with us for a long time. And we want to make sure we utilize everything we can to the best of our ability.
I just want to assure Mr. Waxman, when we ship Texas natural gas to California, he's going to get every cubic foot of gas that he paid for.
If the gentleman will yield, with that assurance, I'm going to withdraw the amendment.
Praise the Lord.
So that we can continue to look at it together and come up with bipartisan.
Remember the Alamo.
I never forget it.
You lost at the Alamo.
We still remember
All
it
right.
because it made us win at San Jacinto.
By unanimous consent, the amendment is withdrawn. Are there further amendments to the amendment in the nature of the substitute? Seen none. If there are no more amendments, the vote occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. No, as amended. No, in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no.
No.
Opinion of the chair that the noes have it. No, all right, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. So with that, the final passage on the bill as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Sounds better. All those opposed say no. No. Ayes appear to have it. Roll call is requested. Clerk will call the roll. It's my understanding that just to give members, Mr. Waxman and I have conferred, we're going to try to put the next bills in block and have those go by voice vote. So this should be the last recorded vote of the afternoon before the committee. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hall. Mr. Barton. Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield votes aye. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus votes aye. Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden votes aye. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry votes aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mrs. McMorris Rogers. Mrs. McMorris Rogers votes aye. Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper votes aye. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Olson. Mr. Olson votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Gardner. Mr. Gardner votes aye. Mr. Pompeo. Mr. Pompeo votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Kinzinger votes aye. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bill Rackus. Mr. Bill Rackus votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mrs. Elmers. Mrs. Elmers votes aye. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman. Mr. Waxman votes no. Mr. Dingle. Mr. Dingle votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Gett. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps votes no. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield votes no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow votes aye. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Christensen. Ms. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. Braley. Mr. Braley votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Lujan. Mr. Lujan votes no. Mr. Tonko. Mr. Tonko votes no. Chairman Upton.
Votes aye.
Chairman Upton votes
Members
aye.
wishing to cast a vote? Mr. Hall, is Mr. Hall recorded?
Mr. Hall votes aye.
Other members wishing to cast a vote? Seeing none, the clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 28 ayes and 14 nays.
28 ayes, 14 nays. The bill is, H.R. 1900 is favorably reported as amendment.
Mr. Chairman, we'd like to reserve the appropriate amount of time for
Absolutely.
other views on this and the other bill.
That'll occur without objection. The chair now asks unanimous consent that the committee adopt and favorably report the following bills as described to the House. H.R. 83, H.R. 2094, H.R. 698, and H.R. 2052 with an amendment filed by Mr. Terry. Without objection, so ordered, and the chair now would recognize Mr. Terry for 5 minutes for a colloquy. Mr. Terry.
Is Ms. Jankowski, we have a colloquy on our amendment as it's being added into and it regards the use or the term benefit and costs, particularly the cost, and I want to let Ms. Jankowski know that on Section 4, subsection B specifies the matters to be considered in the review, including the current economic impact of foreign direct investment in the United States. The term, quote, current economic impact, quote, is intended to cover not only the benefits of foreign direct investment in the United States, but also any costs that may result from such an investment. I yield to the gentlelady.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. Let me just clarify my objection. And while I won't oppose this amendment, I do want to express my reservations. And Mr. Chairman, you worked with me in a very collegial and bipartisan manner to craft a bipartisan bill. H.R. 2052 is a good product. Now we have before us this amendment that makes 3 changes that could be perceived to weaken important provisions of the bill. I have concerns about each of these, but would like to focus on the elimination of cost-benefit language, which you just referred to, regarding the bill's required review of the current economic impact of direct foreign investment. During our negotiations, I suggested that language, that cost and benefit language, be included because I believed that we needed to ensure that the review be balanced, and you agreed. In addition, some of the language in the findings in the sense of Congress could be read as if there are only benefits of FDI and we wanted to be even-handed. While I do believe there are benefits, of course, to FDI, there are also costs that must be considered. Regardless of the amendments before us now, I take the words that you spoke as assurance that the bill's requirement of a review of the current economic impact of foreign direct investment required under this bill will in fact include a review of both the benefits and costs of foreign direct investments. And so I do expect that we'll be able to work together to ensure that the review, should this bill become law, is balanced, and to ensure that any report of this committee on H.R. 2052 include the clarification that you just made.
I respect that, and I agree with you. The gentlelady is right that the cost should be part of that assessment.
And I'd like to yield to Mr. Barrow.
I yield to Mr. Barrow.
I thank the gentleman for the time. I'm a co-sponsor of the Global Investment in American Jobs Act because it's an opportunity to grow American jobs. As in many of our districts, many of my constituents are proud to work in Georgia for companies with foreign ownership. Companies in the 12th District of Georgia like Solvay, YKK, Alstom, and Covidian make incredible contributions to the local economy. They invest in the 12th District, and workers in Georgia are proud to give them a good return on that investment. There's a lot we can still do to grow jobs from within, but if we focus only on that, we're cheating ourselves. We should also focus on being an attractive investment for foreign companies who can also contribute to good-paying, high-quality job opportunities in the American economy. I want to thank the chairman and ranking member of the subcommittee for moving this bill. I know they work closely together to hone this legislation into something I think we can all agree on, which will do some good. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Barrow, and appreciate the support, Ms. Jankowski, Mr. Barrow, and yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the gentlelady from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the Ranking Member Waxman, Chairman Pitts, and Ranking Member Pallone for holding this important markup on the HOPE Act today. Some of us remember the fear and worry that surrounded AIDS in the 1980s. I was working as a nurse in California at the time. We called it Legionnaire's disease. At first, no one even knew what caused AIDS, and the diagnosis was considered and was actually true as a swift death sentence. However, in the last few decades, medical technology and research has transformed HIV/AIDS care and treatment, and now, thanks to these breakthroughs, HIV is a chronic condition. This has led to improved life expectancies, something to celebrate. But it also means that individuals with HIV are more likely to encounter other medical complications as they age, just like any other person. And they face unique complications as the powerful drugs that keep their HIV at bay often take a very hard toll on their bodies. These combination of factors put HIV-positive individuals at a higher risk for ailments like kidney and liver disease, and it places them at a high risk to need an organ transplant. And that's what we're trying to address here. HIV-positive individuals can now safely receive transplants. They wait on the same long waiting list as all Americans, but there might be a better way. According to transplant experts, each year we toss out hundreds of HIV-positive organs that could otherwise be viable for transplantation. Studies in other countries have suggested that these organs could be used to help people who are already HIV positive. These organs have the potential to save lives and lessen the transplant waiting list for all Americans, but instead they go wasted because we cannot even do the research to see if they could be used by those already infected based on this outdated ban. That's why we need to pass the HOPE Act today. The HOPE Act would create a pathway, grounded, of course, in medical science, to research the feasibility and safety of positive to positive organ transplantation. Just think about it. This is a chance to possibly shorten the waiting list for all people waiting for an organ. It also is a possibility to better outcomes for those in need, and it can significantly lower healthcare costs, all while maintaining the safety and integrity of our current organ transplantation system. I want to thank and acknowledge Senators Boxer and Coburn for championing the issue in the Senate. With their leadership, the HOPE Act passed by unanimous consent in June. I'd like to thank my medical colleagues, especially Dr. Harris, the bill's Republican lead, and Dr. Burgess for their support. And finally, I'd like to thank all the advocates who've come together around this bill. The HOPE Act benefits from a very broad and hardworking coalition of supporters. I want to acknowledge one advocate in particular, who's Mr. Thomas Lane, an HIV positive and a double kidney transplant recipient. Tom was incredibly brave to share his story publicly at a briefing last year on this topic. Unfortunately, he recently passed away from chemo complications, but I know he would be heartened by the HOPE Act's momentum. The HOPE Act is a common sense bill that creates a path forward for research on this issue. As I've said, it's supported by a broad coalition of supporters from the medical, the research, and the HIV patient populations. It has strong support on both sides of the Capitol, on both sides of the aisle. It's a critically important issue, an opportunity to save lives. That's why I'm urging a yes vote on it today, and I'm prepared to yield back. But I also want to include, and I'm going to list these because they're significant, Mr. Chairman, letters of support that I would like to enter into the record from the following organizations: the American Medical Association, the American Society of Transplant Surgeons, American Society of Transplantation, United Network for Organ Sharing, the Dialysis Patient Citizens, the American Society for Nephrology, the American Civil Liberties Union, the HIV Medicine Association, and a joint group letter of support featuring many other organizations, including the Association of Organ Procurement Organization and the Organization for Transplant Professionals. With that, I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back, and we again appreciate her good work on that legislation. I would remind my colleagues we've passed these 4 bills. So without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bills reported by the committee. So ordered, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned.